The weathered clay tablets discovered in the ancient ruins of Nippur between 1888 and 1900 contain some of humanity's most extraordinary creation narratives. Among the thousands of cuneiform fragments catalogued by the University of Pennsylvania expeditions, a particular series stands out for its remarkably technical descriptions of human origins. These texts, known collectively as the Enki and Ninmah cycle, describe not mythological metaphors but what appears to be a systematic biological engineering project undertaken by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. The tablets, dating to approximately 2100 BC, but clearly based on much earlier traditions, present humanity's creation as a deliberate act of genetic manipulation performed to solve a specific labour crisis among divine beings. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their matter-of-fact tone and technical precision. Rather than describing mystical acts of divine will, the texts provide step-by-step procedures, list specific materials and their properties, document failed experiments and their corrections, and even include what appear to be gestation periods and success rates. The primary tablet, catalogued as CBS 10673 in the University Museum's collection, describes how the goddess Ninmah, working under the direction of the god Enki, mixed the clay of the Apsu with the blood of a slain god to create the first humans. The precision of these descriptions, including references to 14 pieces of clay, 7 designated for males and 7 for females, each implanted with divine essence and gestated for specified periods, suggests something far more systematic than symbolic mythology. Archaeological evidence from Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever built, reveals construction techniques and urban planning that appeared fully formed rather than developing gradually over time. The deepest excavation levels at the site, dating to approximately 5500 BC, show sophisticated understanding of irrigation, metallurgy, and architectural principles that seem to support the Sumerian claim that civilization was not invented but gifted by divine instructors. If these texts preserve genuine historical memories of genetic intervention in human development, the implications fundamentally challenge our understanding of human origins and the nature of ancient civilizations. The Atrahasis Epic, composed around 1700 BC but preserving much earlier Sumerian traditions, begins not with humanity's creation but with the circumstances that made it necessary. The text describes a period when the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens to earth, divided themselves into 2 classes: the senior gods who directed operations and the Igigi, lesser divine beings assigned to perform the actual physical labour required for their earthly projects. According to Tablet 1 of the Atrahasis, preserved in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, the Igigi were tasked with digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, excavating canals, and constructing the first cities. The text provides specific details about the nature of this labour, describing how the Igigi dug the watercourses, carried baskets of earth, and worked day and night without respite. Tablet Fragment K 3399 from the British Museum collection preserves a poignant passage describing the suffering of these workers, stating that for 40 years they bore the toil, that their labour was heavy and their distress was much. The precision of this 40-year duration appears throughout multiple versions of the text, suggesting it represents an actual recorded time period rather than symbolic numerology. Archaeological evidence from early Sumerian sites supports the massive scale of earth-moving and construction projects described in these texts. Excavations at Eridu, Uruk and Ur reveal sophisticated canal systems, massive platform foundations, and extensive irrigation networks that would have required enormous labour forces to construct. The engineering sophistication of these early projects, appearing fully developed in the archaeological record rather than showing gradual evolution, suggests they were executed according to predetermined plans by organised workforces. The Igigi themselves remain somewhat mysterious in the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. Unlike the senior Anunnaki, who received extensive individual characterization in various myths and hymns, the Igigi function primarily as a collective workforce. Some texts indicate there were 600 Igigi assigned to Earth operations, though other sources give different numbers. What remains consistent across all accounts is their subordinate status and their assignment to physical labour that the senior Anunnaki considered beneath their dignity. The distinction between Anunnaki and Igigi appears not to be one of fundamental nature, but rather of administrative hierarchy, similar to the difference between management and labour in organisational structures. The Igigi performed excavation work that extended far beyond simple agricultural canal digging. Several texts reference mining operations, with the Igigi extracting metals and minerals from beneath the Earth's surface. Tablet BM 46,613 describes how they brought up gold and lapis lazuli from the depths, suggesting extraction operations that required not just surface collection but underground mining. The technical knowledge required for such operations, including ventilation of deep shafts, structural support, and ore processing, indicates that the Igigi possessed sophisticated engineering capabilities despite their labourer status. The geographical scope of Igigi operations extended throughout Mesopotamia and apparently into surrounding regions. References in various administrative texts suggest work sites in the mountains of Lebanon for cedar extraction, in the Persian Gulf region for pearl and shell collection, and in the eastern mountains for lapis lazuli and other precious stones. The coordination of these dispersed operations would have required communication networks, supply chains, and administrative oversight of considerable sophistication. The working conditions described in the Atrahasis Epic deteriorated progressively over the 40-year period. Early passages describe organised labour with assigned tasks and specific quotas. Later sections describe increasing desperation, with workers labouring through the night, suffering from exhaustion, and experiencing what the text terms their faces becoming yellow from the toil. This progression from ordered work to desperate overexertion suggests a system under increasing stress, perhaps due to expanding project requirements or declining workforce numbers. The texts indicate that the Igigi received regular food rations and were housed in work camps near major project sites. Tablet fragments from Nippur describe the distribution system for these rations, including bread, beer, oil, and dates provided to divine workers. The quantities mentioned, though difficult to convert precisely to modern measurements, indicate substantial daily caloric intake necessary to sustain heavy physical labour. The administrative precision of these ration distributions, recorded in the same bureaucratic style used for later human labour management, suggests the Anunnaki operated a sophisticated logistic system to support their workforce. The relationship between the senior Anunnaki and the Igigi appears to have been fundamentally hierarchical, but not initially oppressive. Early passages in the epic describe the assignment of tasks with no indication of protest or resistance. The deterioration of this relationship over 40 years suggests either an increase in demanded output, a decrease in workforce numbers, or the imposition of increasingly difficult projects that exceeded the Igigi's capacity. Some text fragments hint at disagreements among the senior Anunnaki themselves regarding appropriate treatment of their workforce, with Enki apparently advocating for more sustainable labour practices, while Enlil demanded maximum productivity regardless of worker welfare. After 40 years of unrelenting labour, according to the precise chronology preserved in the Atrahasis Epic, the Igigi reached their breaking point. Tablet BM 78,941 from the British Museum collection describes how the working gods burned their tools, set fire to their implements, and marched to the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator of Earth operations. The text provides remarkable detail about this divine labour strike, describing how the Igigi surrounded Enlil's house at night, forcing a crisis that would require intervention from the highest levels of the Anunnaki hierarchy. The description of this rebellion employs language typically used in ancient Near Eastern texts to describe military action. suggesting the event was perceived as a serious threat to the established order. The text states that the Igigi set fire to their spades and put their baskets on the fire, that they held their tools and went to the gate of the shrine of the warrior Enlil. The choice of nighttime for this confrontation appears deliberate, with the text emphasizing that the action occurred in the middle of the watch, suggesting planning and coordination among the rebelling workforce. The reaction of Enlil to this unexpected uprising reveals much about the command structure of Anunnaki operations. Rather than immediately suppressing the rebellion or negotiating with the workers, Enlil's first response was to summon higher authority. The text describes how Enlil's vizier Nusku awakened his master and reported that the Igigi had surrounded the house, that they had come in their fury to the gate of Enlil. This response pattern, seeking guidance from superior authority rather than acting independently, indicates that even Enlil, despite his title as Chief Administrator of Earth Operations, operated within a larger command structure that limited his autonomous decision-making authority. The emergency council that convened in response to the Igigi rebellion included the highest-ranking Anunnaki on Earth. The text names Anu, who held supreme authority and whose permanent residence was apparently not on Earth, Enlil as Earth Administrator, and Enki as the technical director responsible for operational procedures. The convening of this council required time, suggesting that Anu travelled from a distant location to address the crisis personally. The text describes the council meeting in formal terms, with each participant speaking in sequence and their words being recorded, indicating the importance attributed to this gathering. The proceedings of this divine council reveal sophisticated political dynamics and competing perspectives on how to resolve the workforce crisis. Enlil's initial position, as recorded in tablet fragment K3399, was punitive. He demanded to know who had instigated the rebellion, declaring that battle had been prepared and calling for the identification and punishment of the ringleaders. The language used suggests Enlil viewed the rebellion as an act of treason that required decisive suppression to restore order and prevent future challenges to authority. This hardline position apparently had support from some council members who shared Enlil's concern about maintaining discipline and hierarchy. However, Enki presented a dramatically different analysis of the situation. Rather than viewing the rebellion as unjustified insubordination, Enki argued that the Igigi complaint was legitimate. The text preserves his words, stating that their labour was heavy and their distress was much, acknowledging the unbearable working conditions that had provoked the uprising. Enki's position introduced a crucial reframing of the problem from one of discipline to one of operational design, shifting the discussion from how to punish the workers to how to restructure operations to make them sustainable. The debate within the council apparently extended over a considerable period, with the text indicating that multiple arguments were presented and various solutions proposed. Some fragments suggest that options considered included reducing project scope, recruiting additional Igigi from elsewhere, implementing rotating work schedules, or mechanizing certain operations. However, each of these alternatives apparently faced insurmountable practical obstacles. Reducing project scope was unacceptable because it would mean failing to achieve the objectives that had brought the Anunnaki to Earth in the first place. Additional Igigi were not available, as the 600 on Earth already represented the full available workforce. Rotating schedules would merely spread the exhaustion without reducing total labour requirements. Mechanization, while apparently within Anunnaki technological capabilities in some domains, could not address the full range of tasks requiring physical labour. The text reveals that the council remained deadlocked until Enki proposed his revolutionary alternative. The Igigi themselves, according to the text, were not invited to participate in these deliberations or to present their demands directly. Instead, they remained surrounding Enlil's residence while their fate was debated. This exclusion of the actual workers from discussions about their future suggests that the Anunnaki viewed the Igigi as resources to be managed rather than as stakeholders with legitimate voices in decision-making. The power dynamics were entirely top-down, with even the most sympathetic council member like Enki advocating for the Igigi rather than with them. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres at Nippur and other major Sumerian cities reveals architectural features consistent with these described council gatherings. Excavations have uncovered ceremonial chambers with seating arrangements for multiple participants, acoustic properties that would amplify voices for record-keeping purposes, and adjacent archive rooms where administrative decisions were documented on clay tablets. The sophisticated nature of these facilities suggests that formal decision-making procedures involving multiple authorities were regular features of Anunnaki administration rather than emergency responses to crises. Faced with the Igigi rebellion and the impossibility of continuing operations without a workforce, the Anunnaki Council convened to discuss solutions. The cuneiform text describes Enki, the god of wisdom and technical knowledge, proposing a revolutionary solution: the creation of a new type of being that could perform the required labour while allowing the Igigi to return to less strenuous duties. Tablet CBS 10673 records Enki's specific proposal, which involved not creating beings from nothing but modifying an existing creature that already inhabited Earth. The text preserves Enki's words to the council, stating that a primitive being already exists, that this Lulu could be modified to bear the yoke, to carry the toil of the gods. This crucial statement reveals that Enki's proposal was not mystical creation, but biological engineering of existing life forms. The concept was radical because it proposed transferring divine labour obligations to beings of a completely different category, crossing a boundary that apparently had not been considered before. The text indicates that Enki's proposal initially met with skepticism from council members who questioned whether such modification was feasible and whether the resulting beings would be capable of the complex tasks required. Enlil apparently expressed concern that creating intelligent beings might produce competitors rather than servants, that beings with divine essence might eventually challenge Anunnaki authority rather than accepting permanent subordinate status. The detailed record of these objections suggests that the decision to proceed with human creation was not taken lightly, but involved extensive debate about potential consequences and risks. Enki addressed these concerns by presenting a detailed technical proposal that outlined specific procedures, anticipated outcomes, and built-in limitations that would ensure the created beings remained suitable for their intended purpose. Tablet fragment K3399 preserves portions of this technical presentation, describing how the modification process would enhance certain capabilities while deliberately limiting others. The created beings would receive sufficient intelligence to understand complex instructions and perform skilled labour, but not enough to independently develop advanced technology. They would possess language capabilities for communication and coordination, but lack the divine languages used for accessing higher knowledge. They would have physical strength adequate for demanding tasks, but limited lifespans that would prevent the accumulation of experience and knowledge across extended time periods. The strategic logic behind these designed limitations becomes clear when examined from the perspective of workforce management. By creating beings who are capable but dependent, intelligent but not innovative, strong but mortal, the Anunnaki could establish a permanent labour force that would serve reliably without threatening to supplant their creators. The text reveals sophisticated thinking about the relationship between capability and control, suggesting that the Anunnaki understood that excessive limitation would produce useless workers, while insufficient limitation might produce dangerous competitors. The balance point identified by Enki apparently satisfied the Council's concerns about maintaining hierarchical stability while solving the immediate labour crisis. The technical feasibility of Enki's proposal rested on his claimed expertise in biological processes and his previous experience with genetic manipulation. Several texts reference Enki's role as the creator or modifier of various plant and animal species, suggesting he possessed extensive knowledge of life processes and their modification. The House of Creation, a facility described in multiple sources as being under Enki's direction, apparently served as a laboratory where biological experiments were conducted. References to this facility appear in administrative texts from Eridu, where archaeological excavations have revealed underground chambers with features consistent with laboratory or medical functions. Enki's authority in biological matters apparently derived from his specialized training or inherent capabilities that distinguished him from other Anunnaki council members. The text describes him as understanding the secrets of the Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth that symbolize primordial life-giving forces. This metaphorical language likely represents actual technical knowledge of genetic processes, cellular biology, and reproduction mechanisms. The other council members, while presumably intelligent and capable in their own domains, apparently lacked Enki's specific expertise in biological manipulation, making them dependent on his assessment of what was feasible. The council's acceptance of Enki's proposal came with specific conditions that would ensure accountability and reversibility if the project failed. The text describes the establishment of a formal agreement specifying that Enki would bear responsibility for the success or failure of the creation project, that he would provide regular reports to the council on progress, and that he would ensure the created beings could be controlled if they proved unsuitable. These administrative safeguards reveal sophisticated project management practices with clear assignment of responsibility, defined success criteria, and risk mitigation procedures. The scope of Enki's authorization extended beyond simply creating a single prototype to encompass the development of a reproducible template that could generate created beings in quantities sufficient to replace the entire Igigi workforce. The text indicates that hundreds or even thousands of created beings would be required to handle the labor demands across all Anunnaki operations. This production scale requirement meant that Enki needed to develop not just a biological modification procedure, but a reliable reproductive system that would enable mass production of standardized workers. The technical challenges involved in achieving such reproducibility would have been considerable, requiring precise control over the modification process and the ability to replicate successful outcomes consistently. The Sumerian texts make clear that humans were not created from nothing, but rather through the modification of a pre-existing hominid species. The texts refer to as the Lulu, meaning primitive or mixed one. Archaeological evidence from East Africa supports the existence of multiple hominid species inhabiting the region during the time periods the texts describe, including Homo erectus and other tool-using bipedal primates. The texts indicate that these primitive workers already existed and were engaged in basic activities, but lacked the intelligence, language capabilities, and anatomical features necessary for complex labor. The description of the Lulu in various Sumerian sources provides specific details about their characteristics and limitations. Tablet VAT 7851 describes these beings as walking upright, possessing hands capable of grasping and living in social groups, but lacking articulate speech, abstract reasoning, and the ability to follow complex instructions. These descriptions match closely with what modern paleoanthropology understands about pre-sapiens hominids, who possessed bipedal locomotion, opposable thumbs, and basic social organization, but had not yet developed the cognitive capacities characteristic of modern humans. The geographical distribution of the Lulu, according to textual references, centered on regions that modern archaeology identifies as crucial for human evolution. Several tablets reference the land of Abzu, often interpreted as referring to southern Africa, as the primary habitat where these primitive beings were most numerous. This correlation between textual references and the archaeological identification of Africa as the birthplace of human evolution suggests that the Sumerian accounts preserve accurate geographical knowledge about hominid distribution. Mining operations described in earlier tablets apparently brought the Anunnaki into regular contact with these primitive hominids who inhabited the same regions where valuable minerals were extracted. The behavioral characteristics of the Lulu described in Sumerian texts align remarkably well with modern reconstructions of pre-sapiens hominid capabilities. The texts describe these beings as capable of using simple stone tools for basic tasks, living in caves or temporary shelters, hunting small game and gathering plant foods, and forming social bonds within family groups. However, the texts emphasize their lack of forward planning, their inability to execute multi-step procedures, their absence of symbolic or artistic expression, and their limited vocal communication that lacked grammatical structure. These limitations made them unsuitable for the coordinated labor programs that Anunnaki operations required. The population size of the Lulu populations remains unclear from the textual evidence, but references to their abundance in certain regions suggest they were numerous enough to serve as a viable genetic base for the creation project. Some tablets describe the collection or capture of Lulu specimens who would serve as the base material for modification experiments. The ethical considerations involved in using these beings for genetic experiments apparently did not concern the Anunnaki, who viewed the Lulu as simply another form of animal life, rather than as beings with rights or moral status. This perspective enabled the extensive experimentation that the creation process would require. The anatomical suitability of the Lulu as a base species derived from their bipedal posture and freed hands, which meant they already possessed the basic physical structure needed for tool use and carrying loads. The texts emphasize that the primary modifications required were cognitive and reproductive rather than gross anatomical restructuring. This focus on mental rather than physical enhancements suggests that the Lulu already possessed appropriate body plans, and that the creation process concentrated on modifying brain structure, vocal apparatus, and reproductive systems rather than redesigning the entire organism. Archaeological evidence from sites in East Africa reveals the existence of multiple hominid species during the late Pleistocene period that fit the description of the Lulu remarkably well. Homo erectus, which survived until approximately 140,000 years ago, possessed fully bipedal posture, brain sizes averaging 900 to 1,100 cubic centimeters, evidence of tool use and fire control, but no clear indications of symbolic thought, complex language, or advanced social organization. The timing of Homo erectus' presence in Africa overlaps with the periods when Sumerian texts described the Lulu as being available for genetic modification. The behavior patterns reconstructed for Homo erectus based on archaeological evidence match closely with textual descriptions of Lulu capabilities. Evidence from sites like Jokudian in China and Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania shows that Homo erectus populations used standardized stone tools, maintained long-term base camps, controlled fire for cooking and warmth, and hunted large game animals cooperatively. However, these populations produced no art, no burial practices suggesting belief in afterlife, no evidence of long-distance trade networks, and no indication of the abstract thinking that characterizes anatomically modern humans. These archaeological findings support the textual claim that suitable base hominids existed with appropriate physical capabilities but limited cognitive development. The Sumerian texts describe systematic observation of Lulu populations before the creation project commenced, suggesting that Enki and his team conducted detailed studies of base hominid behavior, anatomy, and genetics to assess their suitability for modification. References appear to capture and study of individual Lulu specimens, their transportation to laboratory facilities, and examination of their physical and mental characteristics. This preparatory research phase would have provided the biological data necessary for designing effective modification procedures. The selection criteria for choosing which Lulu specimens to use in the creation project apparently focused on physical health, reproductive viability, and baseline intelligence within the species' range. The texts describe the selection of prime specimens from robust populations, suggesting that Enki sought optimal genetic material to maximize the chances of successful modification. This eugenic approach to base material selection reveals sophisticated understanding that starting conditions significantly affect experimental outcomes. The most technically detailed passages in the Enki and Ninmah cycle describe the specific materials required for the creation process. The text identifies two primary components: the clay of the Apsu, referring to primordial earth or biological substrate, and the blood of a slain god, specifically identified in the Akkadian version as Wi-ila or Geshtu-e, a god described as possessing intelligence and wisdom. The mixing of these two substances, described with remarkable specificity in multiple texts, suggests a procedure that modern genetics would recognize as the introduction of foreign genetic material into existing biological forms. The symbolic language used in these texts likely conceals actual technical procedures beneath mythological terminology that would have been comprehensible to ancient audiences while preserving essential information. The clay of the Apsu receives extensive description in the creation texts, with multiple sources emphasizing its special properties and the specific location from which it must be obtained. Tablet CBS 14459 describes this clay as being taken from above the Apsu, from the place where divine essence and earthly substance meet. The technical meaning behind this metaphorical language becomes clearer when examined alongside other passages describing the Apsu as the source of life, the place from which all living things emerge. Modern biological interpretation would identify this as referring to genetic material, the biological substance that carries hereditary information and enables reproduction. The blood of the slain god represents the second crucial component, and the texts provide remarkably specific details about this material. The god chosen for this sacrifice, Wi-ila in the Akkadian version, and Geshtu-e in Sumerian sources, is explicitly described as possessing intelligence and wisdom above other gods. Tablet K3399 states that he possessed understanding, that his blood would grant intelligence to the created beings. The choice of a highly intelligent god as the donor for this essential material suggests sophisticated understanding that cognitive capabilities are heritable, that intelligence could be transferred through biological material from one being to another. The slaying of Wi-ila for this purpose raises profound ethical questions that the texts acknowledge but do not resolve satisfactorily. Some passages indicate that Wi-ila volunteered for this sacrifice, understanding that his death would enable the creation of beings who would relieve the suffering of the Igigi. Other versions suggest that Wi-ila was selected by the council, and that his sacrifice was compulsory rather than voluntary. The texts describe an assembly where Wi-ila's fate was decided, where his essence would be used for a greater purpose that justified his individual death. This utilitarian reasoning reveals moral frameworks that prioritize collective benefit over individual rights. The actual procedure for extracting and preparing the divine blood receives detailed attention in several tablet fragments. The text describes ritual bathing and purification of Wi-ila before the sacrifice, the use of specific cutting implements to draw the blood, the collection of this blood in sacred vessels, and its mixing with specific mineral compounds that preserved its properties. These preparatory procedures, described with the precision of laboratory protocols, suggest actual chemical or biological treatments that maintained the viability of genetic material during the mixing process. The ratio of clay to blood in the mixture receives specific mention in multiple sources, with the texts indicating that the proportion was critical to successful outcome. Tablet VAT9101 describes the mixture as requiring equal parts of the two substances, that too much clay would produce beings lacking sufficient intelligence, while too much blood would create beings too similar to gods. This attention to proportional balance reveals understanding that genetic modification outcomes depend on the relative quantities of different genetic contributions, a principle that modern genetics confirms through observation of hybrid vigor and genetic dosage effects. The mixing process itself involved more than simple combination of the two materials. The texts describe kneading, working, and shaping the mixture while reciting specific incantations or formulas. While the incantations might seem like magical elements to modern readers, they may represent encoded technical instructions, verbal protocols that ensured consistency in the preparation process. The physical manipulation of the mixture through repeated kneading would have thoroughly integrated the two components at a molecular level, maximizing the opportunity for genetic transfer. The prepared mixture was then divided into 14 portions, 7 for males and 7 for females, with the texts emphasizing that each portion must be exactly equal in size and composition. This requirement for precise division suggests that the quantity of genetic material in each portion was critical for successful development. The number 14 itself may have technical significance beyond symbolic meaning, potentially representing the minimum viable population needed to establish a stable genetic foundation while maintaining gender balance for reproductive sustainability. The preservation and storage of these prepared clay portions before implantation receives attention in administrative texts that describe temperature control, moisture maintenance, and protection from contamination. These storage requirements suggest that the genetic material had specific stability parameters that had to be maintained to prevent degradation. The text describes storage in sacred vessels made of specific materials, kept in chambers with controlled environmental conditions, suggesting that ancient practitioners understood the concept of biological material preservation. Chemical analysis of residues found in vessels from ancient Sumerian temple complexes has revealed traces of organic compounds, including proteins and lipids, that might represent remnants of these preparation procedures. While conclusive identification remains impossible due to the age and degradation of these residues, their presence in vessels described in inventory texts as being used for creation ceremonies provides tantalizing physical evidence that these ritual procedures involved actual biological materials rather than purely symbolic substances. The goddess Ninmah, whose name translates as Great Lady or Exalted Mother, served as the primary geneticist in the creation project according to the Sumerian texts. Tablet VAT-09101 describes her working in a specialized facility called the shimti, meaning house, of where destinies are determined, equipped with specific tools and materials for the creation process. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have uncovered underground chambers beneath the Enki temple complex that contain unusual features consistent with laboratory or medical facilities, including drainage systems, storage areas for materials, and work surfaces of polished stone. The selection of Ninmah for this critical role was not arbitrary, but reflected her specific expertise in what the texts term the shaping of forms and the granting of destinies. Multiple sources describe Ninmah as possessing knowledge of the womb, understanding of gestation processes, and mastery of the techniques necessary for bringing new life into being. Her credentials apparently included previous experience with biological modification projects, though the texts remain vague about the specifics of these earlier endeavours. The choice of a female deity for this role may reflect recognition that reproductive processes were better understood by female practitioners, or it may indicate that Ninmah possessed unique genetic characteristics that were necessary for the procedure to succeed. The shimti facility where Ninmah conducted her work receives detailed architectural description in several tablet fragments. The structure apparently included multiple chambers serving different functions in the creation process. The preparation chamber housed equipment for mixing the clay and blood components, with work surfaces of polished stone that would not absorb or contaminate the materials. Administrative texts from Eridu describe deliveries to this facility of specific minerals, aromatic substances, and precious metals that were apparently necessary for the creation procedures. The quantities mentioned suggest ongoing experimentation rather than single-use applications. The central working chamber contained what texts describe as the shaping tables, flat surfaces where the clay blood mixture was formed into the proto-human shapes that would receive the divine essence. Tablet K8745 describes these tables as being made of cedar wood, overlaid with gold, materials chosen for their lack of reactivity with organic substances. The tables were apparently arranged in specific geometric patterns, with 7 on one side for male creation and 7 on the opposite side for female creation. This spatial organization ensured that the differentiation between male and female forms was maintained throughout the process. The gestation chamber represented the most technically sophisticated part of the facility. The text described this as a warm, dark space maintained at constant temperature and humidity, where the shaped clay pieces would be implanted into the birth goddesses who would carry them to term. Archaeological evidence from the Eridu underground complex reveals chambers with sophisticated ventilation systems that could regulate airflow and temperature. The walls of these chambers show evidence of having been sealed with bitumen and other waterproofing materials to control humidity levels. Stone channels carved into the floors apparently directed water for washing and waste removal, suggesting attention to hygiene that exceeds normal ancient standards. The tools used by Ninmah in the creation process receive specific mention in inventory texts from temple archives. Bronze implements included cutting tools for precise shaping, measuring devices for ensuring accurate proportions, and vessels of specific dimensions for mixing materials. Several texts mention the use of lapis lazuli and carnelian stones in the process, though their exact function remains unclear. These precious stones may have served symbolic purposes, or they may have possessed physical properties that were useful in the technical procedures. Chemical analysis of residues found on stone and metal artifacts from the Eridu complex has revealed traces of organic compounds including proteins and lipids. The staff supporting Ninmah in her work apparently consisted of both divine assistants and trained human personnel. Texts reference the 7 wise women who attended Ninmah, female deities or highly trained priestesses who assisted in various aspects of the creation procedure. Each apparently had a responsibility for specific tasks, with the text describing specializations in mixture preparation, form shaping, implantation procedures, and gestation monitoring. This division of labor suggests a sophisticated understanding of project management and the benefits of specialized expertise. The training required for these assistants apparently involved extensive instruction in both theoretical knowledge and practical techniques. Administrative texts from Nippur describe educational programs for temple priestesses that included anatomy, herbal medicine, and midwifery skills that would have been applicable to the creation project. The most advanced students apparently received additional instruction in what texts call the mysteries of creation, specialized knowledge that was closely guarded and transmitted only to properly qualified individuals. The security measures surrounding the Bit Shimti facility indicate that the creation procedures were considered highly sensitive information, requiring protection from unauthorized access. The text describes sealed doors, guardian positions, and restricted entry protocols that limited access to authorized personnel. This security focus suggests that the Anunnaki recognized the potential dangers if creation knowledge fell into inappropriate hands, or if the procedures were replicated without proper oversight and control. The lighting within the facility receives attention in several sources, with texts describing the use of oil lamps that burn specific aromatic oils, creating both illumination and presumably serving other functions. The choice of lighting fuel, typically cypress or cedar oil, may have had practical purposes related to maintaining appropriate atmospheric conditions, or the aromatic properties may have served ritual functions that helped maintain focus and precision during delicate procedures. The architectural orientation of the Bit Shimti shows deliberate astronomical alignments that connected the facility with celestial phenomena. Excavations reveal that the main entrance faced precisely east, allowing the first rays of morning sun to penetrate the facility at dawn. Other chambers show alignments with specific stellar positions that were significant in Mesopotamian astronomy. These alignments may have served practical timing purposes, indicating optimal periods for various creation procedures, or they may have been intended to channel cosmic influences that the Anunnaki believed affected biological processes. One of the most specific technical details in the creation narratives involves the preparation of exactly 14 pieces of clay, 7 to become males and 7 to become females. The text describes how each piece was carefully prepared, implanted with the divine essence, and then given to birth goddesses for gestation. The specificity of this procedure, including the designation of 14 surrogate mothers and the careful gender balance, suggests systematic reproductive planning rather than mythological storytelling. The precise division of the prepared clay blood mixture into 14 equal portions receives detailed attention in tablet CBS 19847, which describes the weighing and measuring procedures used to ensure exact equality. The text states that Ninmah used a balance scale to verify that each portion was identical in weight, that she measured each piece against a standard measure to confirm uniform dimensions. This obsessive attention to quantitative precision reveals understanding that developmental outcomes depend significantly on initial material quantities, a principle that modern embryology confirms through observations of how cell mass affects developmental processes. The designation of 7 pieces for males and 7 for females reflects more than symbolic number preferences. The texts indicate that male and female creation required identical procedures, but that the pieces were somehow marked or designated at the moment of division to determine ultimate sexual differentiation. Some passages suggest that different incantations or formulas were recited over male versus female portions, while other texts hint at the addition of gender-specific materials that influence developmental outcomes. The biological mechanism by which this early gender determination occurred remains unclear from the textual evidence, but the emphasis on this differentiation at the very beginning of the process suggests understanding that sexual characteristics were not spontaneous, but required deliberate specification. The 14 birth goddesses who would carry these clay pieces to term were apparently selected according to specific criteria that ensured optimal gestation conditions. Tablet VAT 13579 describes these goddesses as being examined for physical health, confirmed as possessing successful previous birthing experience, and verified as having appropriate physiological characteristics for carrying modified beings. The texts indicate that these goddesses understood they were not bearing their own offspring, but serving as gestational carriers for beings who would belong to a different category of existence. The consent or willingness of these birth goddesses to perform this function remains ambiguous in the sources, with some passages suggesting voluntary participation, while others imply compulsory assignment. The implantation procedure by which the prepared clay pieces were placed within the birth goddesses receives remarkably clinical description in several tablet fragments. The text describes how each goddess was positioned on the shaping tables, how Ninmah personally performed the implantation for each of the 14, how specific prayers or formulas were recited during the procedure to ensure successful integration of the clay piece with the goddess's biological systems. The duration of this implantation process apparently took several hours, with each goddess receiving individual attention and care to maximize success probability. The gestation period for these first created humans is specified in multiple sources as 10 lunar months, approximately 300 days by modern calendar reckoning. This duration, longer than the normal 9-month human gestation, may reflect the additional time required for proper development of the enhanced characteristics that distinguished created humans from base Lulu specimens. The texts describe regular monitoring of the pregnant goddesses throughout this period, with Ninmah conducting examinations, preparing special foods and medicines to support healthy development, and performing rituals at specific intervals that were apparently crucial for successful outcomes. The birth process itself receives extensive description that reveals the event was considered both dangerous and momentous. Tablet K3456 describes elaborate preparations for the births, including the assembly of medical equipment, the preparation of the birth chamber with specific aromatic substances, and the gathering of the divine council to witness the emergence of the first created humans. The text indicates that all 14 births occurred on the same day, suggesting either that gestation periods were precisely controlled or that labour was artificially induced to ensure simultaneous delivery. The actual delivery procedures apparently involved complications that required Ninmah's direct intervention. Several texts reference difficulties during birth, including what modern medicine would recognise as breech presentations, excessive bleeding, and failure of labour to progress naturally. Ninmah's successful resolution of these complications through techniques that included manual manipulation, the administration of herbal preparations, and what may have been surgical interventions demonstrates advanced medical knowledge that exceeded normal ancient obstetric practices. The texts emphasise that without Ninmah's expertise, several of the births would have failed, resulting in the death of both the birth goddess and the created being. The immediate post-birth period involved additional procedures that were necessary to ensure the viability of the newborn created humans. The texts describe how the infants were washed with specific solutions, how their umbilical cords were cut with ceremonial knives made of obsidian, and how they were examined carefully to assess their physical characteristics and confirm successful creation. This examination apparently included measurements of body proportions, testing of reflexes, and evaluation of their responsiveness to stimuli. The survival rate of the first 14 created humans appears to have been complete, with all 14 living beyond the immediate post-birth period. The texts celebrate this achievement as validation of Ninmah's expertise and proof that the creation procedure was viable. However, the emphasis on this complete survival rate suggests it was not necessarily expected, that previous attempts may have resulted in failures that were not recorded in the preserved texts or that were deliberately omitted from official accounts. The care and feeding of these first created humans during infancy apparently fell to the birth goddesses who had carried them, creating unusual maternal bonds between divine beings and manufactured beings. The texts describe how these goddesses nursed the infants, provided maternal care and protection, and maintained close relationships with their gestational offspring even after weaning. This emotional dimension, though receiving less attention in the technical creation accounts, appears in other literary sources that describe the affection some goddesses developed for their created children, and their resistance to seeing these beings treated purely as workers. The initial humans created through this process possessed characteristics that set them apart from both the primitive Lulu and the divine Anunnaki. The texts describe these first-generation created humans as possessing enhanced intelligence, language capabilities, and physical strength superior to the base creatures, but still distinctly different from their divine creators. Tablet CBS 14459 describes how these prototype humans were tested for their ability to perform agricultural labour, mining operations, and construction work before being approved for mass production. The physical appearance of these first created humans receives detailed description in several sources that emphasize both their similarities to and differences from the Anunnaki. The texts describe them as being smaller in stature than the gods, with heights reaching approximately 2/3 of divine height. Their skin colour apparently varied, with some having the dark complexion of the southern regions and others displaying the lighter tones of northern areas, suggesting that multiple base Lulu populations contributed genetic material, or that environmental factors affected physical development. Their facial features combined elements of both Lulu and Anunnaki characteristics, creating appearances that were distinctive and identifiable as belonging to this new category of being. The cognitive capabilities of the first created humans represented the most significant enhancement over the base Lulu and the primary justification for the entire creation project. The texts describe how these beings demonstrated immediate ability to understand complex verbal instructions, to remember multi-step procedures, to learn from experience and apply knowledge to new situations. Testing protocols described in administrative tablets reveal that created humans were assessed on their ability to follow directions, to work cooperatively with others, to maintain focus on tasks over extended periods, and to demonstrate initiative in solving problems that arose during work assignments. the language abilities of created humans apparently exceeded initial expectations and created some concern among Anunnaki observers. The texts describe how the first 14 quickly mastered the Anunnaki language used for giving instructions, developing extensive vocabularies and demonstrating grammatical sophistication that approached divine linguistic capabilities. Some passages suggest that restrictions were later imposed on human language development, limiting access to certain terminology and preventing created humans from learning the secret languages used for advanced knowledge transmission. This linguistic restriction became one of several control mechanisms designed to maintain hierarchical separation between creators and created. The physical strength and endurance of created humans proved adequate for the demanding labor requirements that had overwhelmed the Igigi. Testing described in tablet fragments from Uruk involved assigning prototype humans to dig canals, carry heavy loads, and work extended hours under conditions similar to those that had provoked the Igigi rebellion. The texts report that created humans performed satisfactorily in all these tests, demonstrating both sufficient strength for the tasks and adequate endurance to maintain productivity throughout long work periods. Their ability to function in extreme heat, to work in muddy or dusty conditions, and to maintain performance despite physical discomfort apparently exceeded the capabilities of the Igigi. The reproductive capacity of first-generation created humans remained unclear during the initial testing period. The texts indicate that the original 14 were created as 7 male and female pairs, and their sexual characteristics were fully developed at maturity. However, whether these first humans could reproduce naturally or required continued divine intervention to create additional workers became a critical question that affected planning for workforce expansion. The text suggests that initial created humans were intentionally made sterile, requiring continued direct Anunnaki involvement for producing additional workers, but this limitation would later be modified in ways that had profound consequences. The emotional and psychological characteristics of created humans apparently surprised their creators in several respects. The texts describe these beings as forming strong social bonds with one another, displaying loyalty and affection that created cohesive work groups. They demonstrated curiosity about their surroundings and asked questions about things they observed, requiring supervisors to determine what information should be shared and what should be withheld. They showed capacity for emotional responses including joy, sadness, fear, and anger that marked them as having inner lives beyond simple programmed behaviours. The work assignments for prototype humans apparently began cautiously, with simple tasks that allowed supervisors to assess performance and identify any problems before committing to large-scale production. Tablet K9876 describes the assignment of the first created humans to agricultural plots where they learned cultivation techniques, irrigation management, and crop harvesting procedures. Their performance in these agricultural assignments apparently exceeded expectations, with the humans demonstrating not only ability to follow instructions, but capacity to recognize problems and propose solutions that improved productivity. The progression from simple to complex tasks apparently occurred rapidly as supervisors gained confidence in created human capabilities. After successful agricultural assignments, the prototypes were tested in mining operations that required working underground in confined spaces, extracting ores, and transporting heavy loads to surface facilities. The texts report that humans adapted successfully to these more demanding conditions, displaying no inherent limitations that would prevent their use in any type of labour required by Anunnaki operations. Construction assignments provided additional testing of created human capabilities in tasks requiring precision, coordination, and sustained effort over extended time periods. The texts describe prototype humans participating in building projects where they learned to cut and shape stones, to mix and apply mortar, to follow architectural plans, and to work cooperatively in large groups to accomplish complex construction sequences. Their successful performance in these assignments apparently satisfied the divine council that created humans could indeed replace the Igigi across all operational domains. The social organization that developed among prototype humans apparently emerged spontaneously rather than being imposed by their creators. The texts describe how the first 14 naturally formed into family-like groupings, with males and females pairing and demonstrating preference for particular partners. They developed rudimentary cultural practices including shared meals, communal rest periods, and primitive religious observances that appeared to be attempts to honour their divine creators. These emergent social behaviours suggested that created humans possessed innate drives towards social organisation that had not been explicitly programmed into their design. The Enki and Ninmah cycle contains a remarkable section describing creation attempts that failed to produce viable or useful results. In what appears to be a contest between Enki and Ninmah to demonstrate their respective skills, the texts describe the creation of several defective humans, including one who could not hold back his urine, another who had no male or female organs, and a third who lacked strength in his limbs. These failures described with clinical detachment suggest actual experimental records rather than moral fables. The context for these failed experiments apparently involved disagreement between Enki and Ninmah regarding the optimal characteristics for created humans. Tablet VAT17019 describes a feast celebrating the successful creation of the first 14 humans, during which Enki and Ninmah consumed considerable quantities of beer and wine. In their intoxicated state, they apparently engaged in a competition to demonstrate who possessed greater creative skill, with each attempting to create humans with unusual characteristics that the other would then be challenged to find appropriate uses for. The first failed creation produced by Ninmah, described in detail in tablet K7456, resulted in a man who suffered from constant urinary incontinence. The text describes this individual as unable to control his bladder function, requiring constant attendance and creating obvious difficulties for work assignments. Enki's response to this defective creation apparently involved finding a specialized role where the condition would not interfere with productivity. Assigning the individual to water-related tasks where frequent urination would be less problematic. This pragmatic solution to a manufacturing defect reveals attitude toward created beings as resources to be utilized, rather than individuals deserving accommodation regardless of productivity. The second failed creation involved an individual born without sexual organs, possessing neither male nor female characteristics. The texts describe this being as physically strong and mentally capable, but lacking the anatomical features that define gender categories. The social and cultural implications of this ambiguous being apparently created confusion among both divine and human observers, with questions arising about appropriate social roles, work assignments, and relationships with normally sexed individuals. Enki's solution apparently involved creating a special category of temple servant for individuals who did not fit standard gender classifications, a social innovation that would persist in Mesopotamian culture for millennia. Additional failed creations described in the texts included individuals with physical disabilities that prevented normal function. One creation lacked strength in his limbs, being unable to walk or perform physical labour. Another possessed diminished vision that made detailed work impossible. A third suffered from mental impairment that prevented understanding of complex instructions despite normal physical development. These various failures apparently resulted from experimental variations in the mixture ratios, preparation procedures, or gestation conditions that Ninmah introduced to test the boundaries of creation possibilities. Enki's challenge, according to the texts, was to find appropriate roles even for these defective creations, demonstrating that the range of possible humans extended beyond the standard worker template. The contest between Enki and Ninmah apparently reversed when Enki created humans with unusual characteristics that challenged Ninmah to find appropriate uses. The texts describe Enki creating a woman whose body aged rapidly, an individual who could not speak despite normal hearing. and others with various impairments that tested Ninmah's ability to integrate them into productive roles. This exchange of defective creations apparently continued until both parties acknowledged the superior wisdom of the other, ending their competition with mutual respect and recognition that creation was more complex than either had initially appreciated. The documentation of these failed experiments in official texts suggests they served important functions beyond mere entertainment of intoxicated gods. The systematic variation of creation parameters and the careful observation of outcomes reveal experimental methodology that aim to understand the limits and possibilities of the creation process. By deliberately producing defective humans and documenting their characteristics, Ninmah and Enki apparently mapped the parameter space within which viable humans could be created, identifying critical factors that required precise control. The fate of these failed creations apparently varied depending on the severity of their defects. Some individuals with minor impairments were integrated into human communities and assigned specialized roles that accommodated their limitations. Others with more severe problems apparently did not survive to maturity, with the texts making vague references to their premature deaths without providing explicit descriptions of whether these deaths were natural or deliberately induced. The ethical implications of creating deliberately defective humans for experimental purposes apparently did not trouble the Anunnaki, who viewed creation as a technical challenge rather than a moral undertaking. The lessons learned from these failed experiments apparently informed refinements to the creation template that would be used for mass production. The texts indicate that Ninmah incorporated insights from both successful and failed creations into modified procedures that reduce the probability of defects in subsequent productions. The documentation of optimal mixture ratios, precise gestation conditions, and critical intervention points during development all derived from this experimental phase that treated the first created humans as research subjects whose outcomes provided data for process improvement. After multiple iterations and corrections, the texts describe the achievement of a successful template that would serve as the standard for all subsequent human creation. This optimized human, sometimes referred to as the Adamu or Earthling, possessed the ideal combination of intelligence, strength, and reproductive capability. The Eridu Genesis describes how this template was then used to create humans in quantities sufficient to replace the Igigi workers across all Anunnaki operations in Mesopotamia. The characteristics of this perfected template apparently represented careful balancing of multiple competing requirements. The human needed sufficient intelligence to understand complex instructions and learn skilled procedures, but not so much intelligence that independent innovation might threaten divine control. Physical strength needed to be adequate for demanding labor, but not excessive enough to enable physical resistance against divine authority. Reproductive capability became part of the template specifications, though the texts suggest this addition occurred after initial template development and represented a significant modification to the creation protocol. The cognitive capabilities incorporated into the Adamu template apparently included several specific enhancements over base Lulu intelligence. The texts describe created humans as possessing working memory capacity that enabled them to remember and follow multi-step instructions, abstract reasoning abilities that allowed them to understand cause and effect relationships and apply general principles to specific situations, and linguistic processing capabilities that supported complex verbal communication. These enhancements apparently resulted from modifications to brain structure that increased cortical volume, enhanced neural connectivity, and improved information processing efficiency. The physical characteristics of the Adamu template apparently emphasize robustness and endurance over raw power. The texts describe created humans as possessing compact muscular builds, optimized for sustained labor rather than explosive strength, skeletal structures designed to withstand repetitive stress, and cardiovascular systems capable of supporting extended physical exertion. height apparently standardized at approximately 160 to 170 centimeters for males and 150 to 160 centimeters for females, dimensions that balanced reach and leverage for tool use against metabolic efficiency and food requirements. The metabolic characteristics of created humans apparently received careful attention in template design. The texts reference human efficiency in converting food to energy, their ability to function on relatively modest caloric intake, and their capacity to tolerate periods of food scarcity without severe performance degradation. These metabolic optimizations meant that created humans could be sustained with fewer resources than the Igigi had required, improving the economic viability of the creation solution. The reproductive modifications that were eventually incorporated into the Adamu template represented one of the most significant decisions in the creation project. The texts indicate that Enki advocated for granting created humans independent reproductive capacity, arguing that self-sustaining population growth would eliminate the need for continued divine intervention in human production. Other council members apparently opposed this modification, concerned that reproductive independence would make humans less controllable and might eventually lead to population levels that could challenge divine authority. The biological mechanism by which reproductive capability was added to initially sterile created humans apparently involved genetic modifications that activated dormant reproductive systems. The texts describe Enki performing additional procedures on selected individuals from the initial sterile population, modifying their genetic structure to enable sexual reproduction. These modified individuals then became the breeding population from which all subsequent humans descended, carrying both the enhanced characteristics of the Adamu template and the newly granted capacity for independent reproduction. The testing protocols used to validate the perfected Adamu template apparently involved extensive evaluation across multiple performance domains. Administrative tablets describe systematic assessments that measured cognitive abilities through problem-solving tests, evaluated physical capabilities through standardized work assignments, and verified social functionality through observation of group interactions. Only after successful completion of these comprehensive evaluations was the template approved for mass production and large-scale deployment across Anunnaki operations. The documentation of the perfected template apparently included detailed specifications that could be referenced during subsequent production to ensure consistency. Tablet fragments from Eridu describe measurements, mixture ratios, gestation procedures, and developmental milestones that define the standard Adamu characteristics. These specifications apparently functioned as quality control guidelines that enabled detection and correction of deviations from the approved template. The transition from experimental prototype creation to systematic mass production apparently required significant scaling of facilities, personnel, and procedures. The texts describe the establishment of multiple creation centers across different cities, each staffed with trained birth goddesses and technical specialists who could replicate the procedures Ninmah had perfected at Eridu. This distributed production system enabled creation of humans in quantity sufficient to staff all Anunnaki operations, while maintaining quality control through adherence to standardized protocols. Administrative texts from the early dynastic period provide glimpses into the scale of human production following the successful template development. References to humans created by the thousands suggest industrial-scale reproduction programs that distributed created humans to different cities and work sites across Sumer. Tablet CBS 19791 describes the assignment of created humans to specific gods and specific tasks, treating them as manufactured workers allocated according to operational needs. The organizational structure required for managing large-scale human production apparently involves sophisticated logistics and quality control systems that modern manufacturing engineers would recognize. Administrative archives from Nüwa contain detailed records of production quotas, gestation schedules, and delivery timelines that treated human creation as an industrial process, subject to planning and measurement, These texts describe monthly production targets for different creation facilities, with specific numbers assigned to each temple complex operating as a creation center. The quantities mentioned suggest that within several decades of template approval, human populations numbered in the tens of thousands across Mesopotamia. The distribution system for allocating created humans to different work sites and divine overseers apparently followed hierarchical protocols that reflected the Anunnaki power structure. Senior gods received allocations of workers proportional to their status and operational responsibilities, with Enlil receiving the largest workforce for his agricultural and construction projects, Enki receiving substantial numbers for mining and water management operations, and other gods receiving smaller allocations matched to their specific needs. Tablet VAT21089 contains what appears to be a workforce distribution ledger, listing divine recipients and the numbers of male and female workers assigned to each. The geographical distribution of created humans extended across the entire Mesopotamian region, and apparently into surrounding territories where Anunnaki operations required labor support. Archaeological evidence from early dynastic Sumer reveals sudden population increases at sites throughout southern Iraq that correspond chronologically with the creation narratives. Settlement patterns show rapid expansion from a few major centers to numerous smaller sites, suggesting dispersal of created human populations from central production facilities to distributed work locations. The density of human settlement apparently increased dramatically within a relatively brief period, consistent with artificial population growth rather than natural demographic expansion. The training and acculturation of newly created humans apparently required significant resources and organizational effort. The text describes specialized training centers where created humans learned specific skills, received instruction in appropriate social behaviors, and were indoctrinated in the hierarchical relationships that define their subordinate status. These training programs apparently lasted several months for each individual, with graduates then being certified as ready for productive work assignments. The systematic nature of this training process reveals sophisticated understanding of adult learning principles and the requirements for transforming biological raw material into functional workers. Quality control procedures apparently included regular inspections of created humans to verify conformity to template specifications and identify any defects or deviations that might affect work performance. Administrative texts describe examination protocols that assessed physical characteristics, tested cognitive capabilities, and evaluated behavioral traits. Individuals who failed to meet standards apparently faced various outcomes depending on the severity of their deficiencies. Minor deviations were tolerated and individuals were assigned to tasks suited to their actual capabilities. More significant defects apparently resulted in exclusion from work assignments, with the text remaining vague about the ultimate fate of severely defective individuals. The economic calculations underlying the decision to proceed with large-scale human production apparently weighed the costs of creation and maintenance against the value of labor output over expected working lifetimes. Tablet fragments from Lagash contain what appear to be cost-benefit analyses comparing human workers to alternatives, including continued use of Igigi labor or development of mechanical solutions to labor demands. These calculations apparently concluded that created humans represented the most economically efficient solution, providing adequate labor capability at sustainable cost levels that justified initial investment in creation infrastructure. The maintenance cost for human workers apparently proved lower than anticipated in initial planning. The texts describe humans as requiring relatively modest food rations, simple housing, and minimal medical intervention to maintain productivity. Unlike the Igigi, who had demanded specific amenities and working conditions, created humans apparently accepted basic provisions without complaint, making them economically attractive workforce options. This economic advantage apparently justified continued expansion of human populations even after initial labor shortages had been resolved. The social organization that developed within growing human populations apparently required divine oversight to maintain order and productivity. The text described the appointment of human supervisors selected from among the most capable workers who demonstrated leadership abilities and loyalty to their divine masters. These supervisors, granted limited authority over their fellow humans, formed an intermediate layer between divine overseers and common workers. This hierarchical structure apparently enabled efficient management of large workforces without requiring direct divine involvement in routine operational details. The integration of reproductive humans into work assignments apparently occurred gradually as the population transitioned from entirely created individuals to increasing numbers born through natural reproduction. Administrative texts track this transition through changing terminology, with early documents referring to the created ones while later texts distinguish between the first generation and their born descendants. This linguistic evolution suggests that reproductive capacity fundamentally altered the nature of human populations, transforming them from manufactured products to self-perpetuating communities. The establishment of permanent human settlements apparently became necessary as human populations grew beyond levels that could be housed in temporary work camps. The texts describe the founding of villages and towns specifically for human habitation, with divine oversight ensuring appropriate locations and layouts. Archaeological evidence from early dynastic period shows the emergence of numerous small settlements that appear suddenly in the archaeological record without preceding developmental phases, consistent with planned establishment rather than organic growth. These settlements display standardized layouts suggesting central planning and coordination. A crucial turning point in the creation narrative involves the decision to grant created humans the ability to reproduce independently. The Epic of Atrahasis describes this as a modification that occurred after the initial creation, suggesting that first-generation humans were sterile and required continued divine intervention to maintain population levels. The text indicates that Enki, against the wishes of some council members, gave humans the capacity for sexual reproduction, enabling them to become a self-sustaining population. The circumstances that prompted this momentous decision apparently involved both practical considerations and philosophical disagreements within the Anunnaki Council. Tablet K8945 describes debates regarding the sustainability of continued human production through divine gestation, with some council members expressing concern about the ongoing resource costs and the continuing requirement for birth goddess participation. The practical burden of maintaining production facilities and personnel apparently created pressure to develop alternative reproduction methods that would reduce divine involvement. Enlil's opposition to granting humans reproductive independence apparently stemmed from concerns about population control and long-term security implications. The text preserves his arguments that self-reproducing humans would be difficult to limit in numbers, that uncontrolled population growth might eventually create resource competition with divine interests, and that reproductive independence would weaken divine control over human populations. These prescient concerns about the consequences of reproductive autonomy reveal sophisticated understanding of population dynamics and their relationship to power structures. Enki's counter-arguments apparently emphasize the inefficiency and unsustainability of continued direct production. He pointed to the limited number of available birth goddesses, the time and resources required for each creation cycle, and the impossibility of scaling production to meet growing labor demands across expanding operations. His solution, granting humans natural reproductive capacity, would transform population maintenance from an active divine responsibility to a self-sustaining process requiring minimal ongoing intervention. The technical procedure by which reproductive capacity was granted apparently involved genetic modifications to selected individuals who would serve as the breeding foundation for all subsequent humans. The texts describe Enki taking male and female humans from the original created population and modifying their genetic structure to activate reproductive systems that had been deliberately suppressed in the initial template. The language used suggests this modification was more complex than simple removal of a reproduction block, possibly involving multiple genetic changes necessary to establish viable reproductive capability. The selection of which individuals would receive reproductive capability apparently followed strategic considerations regarding genetic diversity and trait preservation. The texts indicate that Enki chose individuals representing the full range of desirable characteristics present in the created population, ensuring that reproductive capacity would be distributed across genetic variants, rather than concentrated in a single line. This approach to founding population genetics suggests sophisticated understanding that diversity improves long-term population viability. The first successful human reproduction apparently occurred within months of the genetic modification procedure, with the text describing celebration and concern in equal measure. The birth of the first naturally conceived human represented proof that the modification had worked, and that humans could indeed maintain their population without continued divine production. However, this success also marked the point at which human population dynamics shifted from divine control to natural processes governed by human reproductive behaviors. The immediate consequences of reproductive capability apparently included rapid population growth that exceeded initial projections. The texts describe human populations doubling and redoubling within relatively brief periods as reproductive individuals produced offspring, who themselves reached reproductive maturity and began producing the next generation. This exponential growth pattern apparently caused alarm among some Anunnaki observers, who recognized that population numbers were escaping the bounded limits they had anticipated. The social and cultural implications of natural human reproduction apparently created unexpected complications for the hierarchical relationship between gods and humans. The text suggests that humans born through natural reproduction rather than divine creation developed somewhat different attitudes toward their divine overseers. While created humans apparently viewed the Anunnaki as literal parents deserving absolute obedience, naturally born humans possessed more attenuated relationships to divine authority. This generational shift in attitudes toward divine rule apparently contributed to growing tensions that would eventually precipitate major conflicts. The genetic consequences of human reproductive autonomy apparently included gradual drift from the optimized Adamu template, as natural selection and mutation introduced variation into human populations. Administrative texts from later periods describe increasing diversity in human physical characteristics, cognitive capabilities, and behavioral traits as naturally evolving populations diverged from the controlled uniformity of the original created stock. Some texts suggest that periodic divine intervention was required to correct problematic genetic drift and maintain desirable characteristics within human populations. The regulation of human reproduction apparently became a focus of divine policy as the implications of uncontrolled population growth became apparent. The texts describe attempts to limit human fertility through various means, including dietary restrictions, mandated celibacy periods, and selective permission for reproductive unions. These control measures apparently proved difficult to enforce consistently, with human reproductive drives and desires frequently overcoming imposed restrictions. The legal and social frameworks established to govern human reproduction apparently drew distinctions between approved and unapproved reproductive unions. The texts reference the establishment of marriage systems that required divine permission for reproductive pairings, with penalties specified for unauthorized reproduction. These regulatory systems apparently aim to maintain quality control over human genetic lines, while allowing sufficient population growth to meet labor demands. The long-term sustainability concerns that Enlil had raised apparently proved prescient as human populations continued to grow and spread across expanding geographical ranges. The texts describe increasing friction between divine interests and human population pressures, with competition for resources and territory becoming sources of conflict. The decision to grant reproductive capacity, while solving immediate production problems, apparently created longer-term challenges that would require additional interventions to resolve. Modern genetic research has identified peculiarities in human DNA that distinguish our species from other primates in ways that evolutionary gradual development struggles to explain. The sudden appearance of chromosome 2 in humans, formed from the fusion of two separate ape chromosomes, represents a genetic modification that geneticists describe as appearing relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Additionally, the presence of what molecular biologists term junk DNA, sequences that do not code for proteins but appear to contain information, has led some researchers to propose that human DNA contains evidence of artificial modification. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA, but only about 1.5% of this genetic material codes for proteins that directly determine biological characteristics. The remaining 98.5% consists of non-coding sequences whose functions remain largely mysterious to modern genetics. Conventional evolutionary theory struggles to explain why natural selection would preserve such vast amounts of apparently functionless DNA across millions of years of primate evolution. However, recent research has revealed that some of these non-coding regions contain regulatory sequences, structural elements, and what appears to be informational content whose purpose remains unclear. The chromosome 2 fusion that distinguishes humans from other great apes represents one of the most dramatic genetic differences between our species and our closest primate relatives. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all possess 24 pairs of chromosomes, while humans possess only 23 pairs. Detailed genetic analysis has revealed that human chromosome 2 formed through the fusion of two separate chromosomes that remain distinct in other apes. The fusion site, visible in human DNA as a region where telomere sequences appear in the middle of the chromosome rather than at the ends, provides clear evidence that two chromosomes merge to create the current human configuration. The timing of this chromosome fusion, estimated through molecular clock analysis to have occurred between several 100,000 and 1 million years ago, corresponds roughly with the emergence of anatomically modern humans. The precision of the fusion event, which somehow occurred without loss of essential genetic information from either parent chromosome, represents a remarkable genetic accident if attributed to natural mutation. The probability of such a beneficial fusion occurring spontaneously and spreading through an entire population appears extraordinarily low according to population genetics models. The functional consequences of the chromosome fusion apparently included changes in gene regulation and expression patterns that contributed to the development of human-specific characteristics. Genes located near the fusion site show altered regulation compared to their equivalents in other primates, suggesting that the fusion event had cascading effects on multiple biological systems. These regulatory changes apparently affected brain development, skeletal structure, and metabolic processes that distinguish humans from other apes. The human accelerated regions identified through comparative genomics represent additional evidence of recent and dramatic genetic changes. These are DNA sequences that show minimal variation across most mammals, but display substantial differences in humans compared to our closest primate relatives. At least 49 such regions have been identified, many located near genes involved in brain development and function. The changes in these regions apparently occurred rapidly on evolutionary timescales, with mutation rates far exceeding background levels seen in other parts of the genome. The HR1 region, the first human accelerated region to be identified, shows 18 base pair differences between humans and chimpanzees in a sequence of only 118 base pairs. This region, which remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of millions of years of mammalian evolution, underwent dramatic modification during the relatively brief period leading to modern humans. The region appears to function as a regulatory element affecting brain development, suggesting that the rapid changes contributed to the cognitive enhancements distinguishing humans from other primates. The distribution of genetic variants within modern human populations reveals patterns suggesting recent genetic bottlenecks and population expansions that correlate with the timelines described in Sumerian creation texts. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA diversity indicates that all modern humans descend from a relatively small founding population that existed approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. This mitochondrial Eve represents the most recent common ancestor of all humans through maternal lines, corresponding roughly with the time period when Sumerian texts describe the creation and dispersal of modified humans. The Y chromosome Adam, the most recent common ancestor through paternal lines, apparently lived somewhat more recently, approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, according to genetic analysis. The timing difference between mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam suggests complex population dynamics during human origins that might reflect multiple creation events or staged introduction of reproductive capacity described in the ancient texts. The relatively recent common ancestry of all humans compared to the much deeper divergences seen between other great ape species suggests that human populations underwent recent genetic constriction that reduced diversity. The FOXP2 gene, the ASPM gene, and the microcephalin gene all show evidence of recent positive selection in humans, indicating that these genes underwent beneficial mutations that spread rapidly through human populations. These genes all affect brain development and cognitive function, consistent with the Sumerian accounts describing enhancement of mental capabilities as a primary goal of human creation. The specific mutations in these genes that distinguish humans from other primates apparently occurred within the time frame described in ancient texts for divine intervention in human development. The presence of apparently designed features in human DNA, including precisely structured regulatory regions, optimized coding sequences, and integrated viral elements that serve beneficial functions, has led some geneticists to propose that human DNA shows evidence of engineering rather than purely natural evolution. While mainstream genetics attributes these features to natural selection, operating on random mutations, the pattern and timing of human-specific genetic changes appear consistent with deliberate modification of pre-existing primate genomes. The archaeological record shows a dramatic and relatively sudden increase in cranial capacity between archaic hominids and anatomically modern humans. While Homo erectus maintained brain sizes around 900 to 1,100 cubic centimeters for over 1 million years, anatomically modern humans emerged with brain capacities averaging 1,350 cubic centimeters, a 30% increase that occurred in a geological instant. The Sumerian texts attribute this enhancement to the infusion of divine essence, suggesting that the cognitive capabilities distinguishing modern humans resulted from deliberate genetic modification. The measurement of cranial capacity in fossil specimens provides direct physical evidence of brain size evolution that can be tracked across different hominid species and time periods. The fossil record shows that brain size remained relatively stable within species, but increased dramatically during transitions from one species to another. Australopithecines, early hominids living between 4 million and 2 million years ago, possessed cranial capacities of 400 to 550 cubic centimeters, comparable to modern great apes. Homo habilis, appearing approximately 2.4 million years ago, showed increased cranial capacity averaging 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus, emerging approximately 1.9 million years ago, achieved brain sizes of 900 to 1,100 cubic centimeters, where they remained stable for over 1 million years. This long period of stasis followed by rapid increase challenges gradualist models of brain evolution. The transition from Homo erectus to anatomically modern Homo sapiens approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago involved cranial capacity increases from roughly 1,000 cubic centimeters to 1,350 cubic centimeters. This 30 to 35% increase occurred over a relatively brief period of perhaps 100,000 years, representing an evolutionary acceleration that conventional mechanisms of natural selection struggle to explain. The energetic costs of supporting larger brains would have required corresponding increases in food acquisition efficiency that the archaeological record does not clearly document. The relationship between brain size and intelligence remains complex, but comparative neuroscience clearly demonstrates that absolute brain size correlates with cognitive capabilities across species. The threefold increase in hominid brain size from Australopithecines to modern humans corresponds with dramatic increases in tool complexity, social organization, and abstract thinking capabilities visible in the archaeological record. The human brain's expansion apparently involved not just increased size, but structural reorganization that enhanced connectivity and processing efficiency. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive functions including planning, decision-making, and social behavior, expanded disproportionately in humans compared to other brain regions. This selective enhancement of specific cognitive systems suggests targeted modification rather than uniform growth. The neural density and connectivity patterns distinguishing human brains from other primate brains apparently required genetic changes affecting brain development processes. The extended period of human brain development, continuing into the third decade of life compared to completion by early adolescence in other apes, apparently results from genetic modifications affecting developmental timing. The Sumerian concept of divine essence might represent pre-scientific understanding of genetic material affecting brain development. The infusion of divine blood described in creation texts could metaphorically represent introduction of genes that enhanced neural development, increased synaptic connections, and extended developmental periods. The specific mention of using blood from a god possessing intelligence and wisdom suggests understanding that cognitive capabilities could be transferred through biological material. The archaeological appearance of behaviors requiring advanced cognition correlates closely with increases in cranial capacity visible in the fossil record. Evidence for symbolic thought, complex language, artistic expression, and abstract reasoning emerges suddenly in the archaeological record around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, corresponding with the full establishment of anatomically modern humans with contemporary brain sizes. This behavioral revolution apparently required not just larger brains, but qualitatively different cognitive architectures that enabled novel forms of thought and communication. The energy requirements for supporting enlarged brains represent significant metabolic burdens that would require adaptive changes beyond simple brain expansion. The human brain, despite representing only 2% of body weight, consumes approximately 20% of resting metabolic energy. The dramatic increase in relative brain size during human evolution required corresponding changes in metabolic efficiency, digestive systems, and dietary patterns. Archaeological evidence shows changes in human diet, including increased consumption of energy-dense foods and improved food processing techniques that appeared coincident with brain expansion. The genetic changes underlying brain size increases apparently involved modifications to regulatory genes, controlling developmental processes rather than simple mutations affecting individual structural proteins. The comparison of human and chimpanzee genomes reveals relatively few differences in genes coding for brain proteins, but substantial differences in regulatory regions controlling when, where, and how strongly these genes are expressed. This pattern suggests that human cognitive enhancement resulted from sophisticated reprogramming of existing genetic systems, rather than invention of entirely new biological mechanisms. Recent genetic research has identified the FOXP2 gene as critical for human language development, and this gene shows evidence of recent modification that distinguishes humans from other primates. The gene contains two mutations that occurred within the last 200,000 years, precisely the period when archaeological evidence indicates the emergence of complex language and symbolic thought. The Sumerian texts explicitly state that language was one of the primary gifts given to created humans, enabling them to receive instructions and coordinate complex labour. The discovery of the FOXP2 gene's importance for language emerged from studies of a British family in which multiple members suffered from severe speech and language impairment. Genetic analysis revealed that affected family members carried a mutated version of the FOXP2 gene, establishing its critical role in language development. The human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by only 2 amino acid substitutions, but these small changes apparently have profound effects on language capabilities. The timing of these FOXP2 mutations, estimated through molecular clock analysis to have occurred approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, corresponds remarkably with the period described in Sumerian texts for human creation. The gene apparently affects brain regions critical for speech production and language processing, including Broca's area and related motor cortex regions controlling vocal articulation. The mutations change the protein's function in ways that enhance the precision and complexity of vocal control necessary for articulate speech. The archaeological evidence for language emergence remains indirect since spoken language leaves no fossil traces, but material culture provides proxy indicators of linguistic capabilities. The appearance of symbolic artifacts including decorative objects, burial practices suggesting belief systems, and complex tools requiring verbal instruction for knowledge transmission all point to sophisticated language use. These behavioural indicators emerge in the archaeological record approximately 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, corresponding with the establishment of anatomically modern humans carrying the modified FOXP2 gene. The sudden appearance of cave art throughout Europe and Asia approximately 30,000 to 40,000 years ago represents compelling evidence for the emergence of symbolic thinking and complex communication. The sophistication of these artistic traditions, appearing fully formed rather than showing gradual development, suggests that the underlying cognitive and linguistic capabilities had already been established. The ability to plan and execute complex artistic projects, to develop and transmit artistic techniques, and to embed symbolic meanings in visual representations all require advanced language capabilities. The FOXP2 gene's effects extend beyond simple speech production to encompass broader aspects of communication and social coordination. Studies of the gene in other species reveal its involvement in vocal learning and social communication across diverse taxa, including songbirds and bats. The human modifications to this ancient gene apparently enhanced existing communication systems rather than creating entirely new capabilities, consistent with Sumerian accounts describing enhancement of base Lulu capabilities rather than creation from nothing. The specific functions of the FOXP2 protein involve transcriptional regulation, meaning it controls the expression of numerous other genes involved in brain development and function. The 2 amino acid changes distinguishing human FOXP2 from the ape version apparently alter which genes it regulates and how strongly, creating cascading effects throughout developmental processes. This regulatory role suggests that relatively small genetic changes can have profound functional consequences when they affect controlling elements rather than structural components. The distribution of FOXP2 variants in modern human populations shows remarkably little diversity, indicating that the beneficial mutation spread rapidly through early human populations through strong positive selection. This rapid spread suggests that language capabilities provided such significant adaptive advantages that individuals carrying the modified gene substantially outcompeted those with earlier versions. The Sumerian accounts describing language as one of the primary enhancements given to created humans align with this genetic evidence of recent selection for language. Capabilities. The neural circuits affected by FOXP2 apparently include not only brain regions involved in speech production, but also areas supporting comprehension, grammar processing, and abstract symbolic manipulation. The gene's expression during early childhood development affects the establishment of neural networks that will support language throughout life. Disruptions to FOXP2 function during critical developmental windows apparently prevent the proper establishment of these language circuits, resulting in permanent impairment. The evolutionary origin of the human-specific FOXP2 mutations remains unexplained by conventional models emphasizing gradual accumulation of random mutations. The simultaneous occurrence of two beneficial mutations in the same gene appears statistically improbable, leading some researchers to propose that the changes resulted from a single genetic event rather than sequential independent mutations. This pattern might be consistent with deliberate genetic modification rather than random evolutionary change. The Sumerian texts make repeated references to differences in lifespan between the Anunnaki and created humans, describing the gods as possessing far longer lives than their human servants. Modern genetic research has identified telomeres, protective caps on chromosomes, as a primary factor in cellular aging, and telomere length varies significantly between species. The texts suggest that limited lifespan was a deliberate design feature of created humans, ensuring that workers would remain dependent on divine oversight rather than accumulating knowledge and capabilities across extended lifetimes. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves one of the most explicit discussions of the mortality difference between divine and human beings. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu, the gods explain that death was assigned to humans at the time of their creation, that immortality was kept for the gods alone. This distinction apparently represented not an arbitrary divine preference, but a deliberate design decision incorporated into the human template. The practical benefits of limited human lifespan from the Anunnaki perspective apparently included workforce management advantages and reduction of long-term security risks. Workers who lived only brief spans would remain perpetually inexperienced compared to their immortal or long-lived divine overseers. Each human generation would need to relearn skills and knowledge, preventing the accumulation of expertise that might enable humans to challenge divine authority. The rapid turnover of human populations also meant that any problematic individuals or groups would disappear quickly, preventing the emergence of persistent opposition movements. The biological mechanisms underlying aging have become increasingly understood through modern molecular biology research. Telomeres, repetitive DNA sequences at chromosome ends, shorten with each cell division until reaching critical lengths that trigger cellular senescence or death. Species with longer telomeres generally live longer, and the enzyme telomerase can extend telomeres and delay aging. The discovery that telomere length correlates with lifespan across species suggests that aging rates are genetically programmed rather than inevitable consequences of biological processes. Human telomeres average approximately 8,000 to 15,000 base pairs at birth, shortening by approximately 25 to 200 base pairs with each cell division. After approximately 50 to 70 divisions, most human cells reach the Hayflick limit where telomeres become too short to support continued division. This cellular aging process contributes to tissue degradation and organ failure that characterizes human aging. The relatively short human telomeres compared to some other mammalian species suggest that human aging rates were set at levels supporting lifespans of several decades rather than centuries. The genetic control of telomerase expression apparently represents one mechanism by which lifespan could be deliberately engineered. Most human somatic cells suppress telomerase expressions after early development, allowing telomeres to shorten progressively. However, germ cells and certain stem cells maintain telomerase activity, preserving their reproductive and regenerative capacities. Cancer cells often reactivate telomerase, gaining unlimited replicative potential that contributes to their immortality. The fact that humans possess functional telomerase genes but suppress their expression in most tissues suggests deliberate regulation rather than simple absence of life-extending mechanisms. The Sumerian king list's description of antediluvian rulers living for tens of thousands of years, followed by post-flood rulers with dramatically shorter lifespans, suggest that human aging rates may have been modified over time. If the early humans described in these texts possessed longer lifespans due to retention of more Anunnaki genetic characteristics, subsequent modifications that shortened lifespans would explain the documented transition from extended to abbreviated life expectancies. This narrative arc from long-lived early humans to shorter-lived later populations appears in multiple ancient traditions. The biblical patriarchs described in Genesis display similar patterns, with pre-flood figures like Methuselah living 969 years, while post-flood lifespans rapidly decreased to levels approaching modern human experience. Noah lived 950 years, his son Shem 600 years. Subsequent generations showing progressive reductions until stabilizing around 70 to 80 years by the time of Moses. This consistent cross-cultural pattern of declining human lifespan suggests preservation of actual historical transitions, rather than independent mythological invention. The metabolic rate relationships to lifespan observed across species provide additional context for understanding engineered aging. Species with slower metabolic rates generally live longer, following patterns described by the rate of living theory. Humans possess relatively slow metabolic rates compared to similar-sized mammals, yet we age faster than our metabolic rates would predict, suggesting that factors beyond simple metabolic wear determine human lifespan. This disconnect between metabolic rate and aging rate might indicate artificial acceleration of aging processes beyond what metabolism alone would produce. The oxidative damage theory of aging proposes that accumulated molecular damage from reactive oxygen species produced during metabolism drives the aging process. Species with more effective antioxidant systems or DNA repair mechanisms generally live longer. The human complement of these protective systems appears adequate but not optimized, providing sufficient function to support several decades of healthy life, but not the extended lifespans that more robust systems could enable. This intermediate level of protective capacity might reflect deliberate calibration to produce desired lifespan ranges. The programmed aging theories propose that senescence results from evolved genetic programs rather than simple accumulation of damage. Evidence supporting programmed aging includes the existence of genes that actively promote aging, the correlation of aging rates with species reproductive strategies, and the observation that removing certain genes can extend lifespan without apparent negative consequences. These findings suggest that aging represents an evolved adaptation rather than inevitable biological decay, making it amenable to genetic engineering. The practical implications of limited human lifespan for Anunnaki control apparently extended beyond simple workforce management to include cultural and technological constraints. A species with 70-year lifespans cannot easily preserve detailed technical knowledge across generations without writing systems and institutional supports. The loss of knowledge between generations would keep human technological capabilities bounded within ranges that divine overseers could monitor and control. Only with divine permission and assistance could humans develop complex technologies requiring multi-generational development efforts. The apparent flexibility of aging mechanisms suggested by comparative biology indicates that lifespan represents a parameter that could be adjusted through genetic modification. Different species achieve radically different lifespans despite sharing fundamental cellular processes, demonstrating that aging rates can be tuned across wide ranges. The naked mole rat, a rodent living over 30 years compared to 2 years for similar-sized mice, demonstrates that relatively small genetic changes can produce dramatic lifespan extensions. These examples support the feasibility of deliberately engineering specific aging rates into created species. Egyptian texts from the Temple of Khnum at Esna describe remarkably similar creation procedures involving the ram-headed god Khnum, fashioning humans on a potter's wheel using clay mixed with divine essence. The texts describe Khnum creating humans in both male and female forms, maintaining careful balance between the two, and implanting them with K, the Egyptian term for life force or spirit that closely parallels the Mesopotamian concept of divine essence. The architectural and iconographic parallels between Khnum temples and descriptions of Ninmah's creation facility suggest these accounts describe the same technology adapted to different cultural contexts. The Khnum creation theology achieved particular prominence during the New Kingdom period, with the temple at Esna becoming a major centre for preserving and transmitting these traditions. The temple walls contain extensive hieroglyphic texts describing Khnum's role as the creator of humans and animals, the fashioner of bodies, the one who gives form to all beings. The detailed nature of these inscriptions, including specific procedures and materials used in creation, suggests they preserve actual technical knowledge rather than purely symbolic religious concepts. The potter's wheel symbolism appears throughout Egyptian creation accounts as the primary tool through which Khnum shapes living beings. However, the wheel may represent metaphorical language for actual biological processes that ancient observers understood through mechanical analogies. The circular motion of the wheel, the gradual shaping of formless clay into defined forms, and the transformation of raw materials into finished products all parallel genetic engineering procedures that transform undifferentiated biological material into specific organisms. The Esna texts describe Khnum mixing clay from the Nile with divine fluids to create the substance from which humans are formed. This combination of earthly matter with divine essence precisely parallels the Mesopotamian accounts of mixing clay from the Apsu with the blood of divine beings. The consistency of this two-component mixture across different cultural traditions suggests preservation of actual technical knowledge about biological creation, requiring both base organic material and genetic material from advanced sources. The K concept central to Egyptian creation theology apparently represents the same life-giving essence, described in Mesopotamian texts as divine blood. The Ka was understood as a vital force transmitted from creator to created being, enabling life and consciousness. The hieroglyphic symbol for K shows two upraised arms, possibly representing the act of passing or transferring this essential quality from one being to another. The K was not created spontaneously, but had to be deliberately implanted through specific procedures performed by qualified divine craftsmen. The Khnum temples at Esna and other sites contain architectural features suggesting they served functions beyond conventional worship. Underground chambers beneath the main temple complex apparently functioned as creation facilities or laboratories, similar to those described in Mesopotamian accounts. Excavations conducted by the Egyptian Antiquities Organization have revealed sealed chambers containing equipment whose purposes remain unclear to archaeologists, but which show parallels to apparatus found at Mesopotamian sites associated with creation activities. The gender balance emphasized in Egyptian creation accounts mirrors the Mesopotamian attention to creating equal numbers of males and females. The Esna texts describe Khnum fashioning humans in pairs, ensuring that each male had a female counterpart. This systematic approach to gender distribution suggests understanding that stable populations require balanced sex ratios, and that reproductive viability depends on having adequate numbers of both sexes. The biological engineering implied by this careful gender balancing reveals sophisticated population planning. The role of female deities in Egyptian creation traditions parallels Ninmah's function in Mesopotamian accounts. The goddess Heket, associated with childbirth and depicted as frog-headed, apparently assisted Khnum in bringing created humans to life, serving functions similar to the birth goddesses described in Sumerian texts. Hecat's particular association with the final stages of creation, animating the formed clay with breath of life, suggests specialization in procedures that activated biological functions in created organisms. The coffin texts and pyramid texts contain references to creation procedures that provide additional technical detail supplementing the Esna temple inscriptions. These funerary texts describe the deceased seeking to reverse the creation process, returning to the primordial state before formation by Khnum. The language used in these passages provides insight into Egyptian understanding of creation as involving irreversible transformations of primordial matter into specific forms consistent with modern understanding of genetic specialization during development. The chronology of Egyptian creation traditions places the original human creation in the first time, the Zep-Tepi period when the gods ruled Egypt directly. This primordial era corresponds chronologically with the Mesopotamian accounts of divine beings, creating humans before the establishment of human kingship. The parallel timing across different cultural traditions suggests these accounts preserved memories of the same historical period when advanced beings undertook biological engineering projects in multiple geographical regions. The distribution of creation knowledge across ancient Egyptian religious centers indicates that understanding of human origins was considered sacred information requiring controlled transmission. Different temples apparently specialized in preserving different aspects of creation knowledge, with Esna focusing on Khnum's role, Heliopolis preserving accounts emphasizing Rhea's creative powers, and Memphis maintaining traditions centered on Ptah as supreme craftsman. This distributed preservation system ensured knowledge survival, even if individual centers were destroyed. The artistic representations of Khnum fashioning humans on his potter's wheel provide visual documentation of creation procedures that supplement textual accounts. Temple reliefs show Khnum seated at his wheel with clay forms of humans at various stages of completion, divine assistants preparing materials and tending to finish creations, and the car being transmitted to completed humans through specific gestures and procedures. These iconographic programs apparently served educational functions, preserving technical information in visual form accessible to those unable to read hieroglyphic texts. The continuity of Egyptian creation traditions across thousands of years of dynastic history suggests that core knowledge about human origins remained consistent despite political and religious changes. From Old Kingdom pyramid texts through Ptolemaic period temple inscriptions, the essential elements of creation through mixing earthly and divine substances remains constant. This remarkable consistency across 3,000 years of cultural evolution indicates preservation of foundational knowledge considered too important to modify or reinterpret substantially. Hindu sacred texts, particularly the Rig Veda and the Puranas, contain creation accounts describing the mixture of divine and earthly substances to produce humanity. The Puranas specifically describe Brahma creating humans through a process involving the combination of his own essence with material substance, producing beings who possessed partial divine capabilities but remained fundamentally material in nature. The Sanskrit term used for this mixing process shares linguistic roots with Sumerian terms for biological combination, suggesting transmission of knowledge between ancient civilizations. The Rig Veda, composed between 1500 and 1200 BC, but preserving much older oral traditions, contains creation hymns that describe the origins of humanity in terms that parallel Mesopotamian and Egyptian accounts. The Purusha Sukta hymn describes the cosmic being, Purusha being sacrificed and divided, with different human social classes emerging from different parts of his body. This dismemberment and distribution motif resonates with the Mesopotamian account of Wiila being slain and his blood distributed to create humans, suggesting common origins for these traditions. The Puranic accounts provide more detailed descriptions of creation procedures that closely parallel Mesopotamian technical descriptions. The Vishnu Purana describes Brahma creating humans by combining his mental powers with physical materials, producing beings who possessed consciousness and intelligence derived from divine sources, but physical bodies composed of earthly elements. This dualistic composition explicitly addresses the same question explored in Mesopotamian texts regarding how to create beings who combine divine and earthly characteristics. The Sanskrit terminology used in creation accounts reveals linguistic connections to Sumerian and Akkadian technical vocabulary. The term prakriti, referring to primordial matter or nature, shares etymological roots with Mesopotamian terms for the clay or earth used in creation. The concept of prana, the vital life force similar to Egyptian Ka and Mesopotamian divine essence, appears to derive from common ancient understanding of a transferable biological quality that enables life and consciousness. These linguistic parallels suggest knowledge transmission through ancient trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley. The role of Brahma as creator god parallels Enki's function in Mesopotamian accounts, with both deities portrayed as possessing specialized knowledge of creation procedures and serving as primary executors of biological engineering projects. The four-headed iconography of Brahma might symbolically represent his ability to work on multiple aspects of creation simultaneously. Paralleling Mesopotamian accounts describing teams of birth goddesses working in coordinated fashion to produce created beings efficiently. The Puranic description of multiple creation attempts before achieving successful human forms parallels the Mesopotamian accounts of failed experiments documented in the Enki and Ninmah cycle. The Matsya Purana describes Brahma creating various types of beings with different characteristics, some proving unsuitable for their intended purposes and requiring modifications or abandonment. This trial and error approach to biological engineering appears consistently across creation traditions from different cultures, suggesting preservation of actual historical development processes rather than idealized mystical origins. The caste system described in Hindu texts as originating during creation apparently reflects genetic or functional differences among humans created for different purposes. The division of humanity into Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, emerging from different parts of Purusha's body, might preserve memories of distinct human lines engineered with specialized capabilities. This interpretation finds support in genetic studies showing that Indian caste groups display measurable genetic differences despite thousands of years of geographical proximity. The concept of successive world ages described in Hindu cosmology parallels Mesopotamian cyclical time concepts and provides context for understanding creation as a recurring process rather than a singular event. The Puranas describe previous worlds inhabited by different types of humans, each world ending in destruction, followed by recreation of new human forms adapted to changed conditions. This cyclical creation model suggests that human biological engineering occurred multiple times throughout history, with each iteration producing populations adapted to specific environmental and operational requirements. The role of female deities in Hindu creation traditions parallels the importance of goddesses in Mesopotamian and Egyptian accounts. Saraswati, goddess of knowledge and creativity, apparently assisted Brahma in creation activities, while Parvati and other female deities performed functions similar to the birth goddesses described in Sumerian texts. This consistent cross-cultural emphasis on female divine participation in creation suggests that actual biological procedures required both male and female involvement, possibly reflecting understanding of sexual reproduction or the specific roles of male and female genetic contributions. The yogic and tantric traditions preserved in Hindu esotericism contain detailed knowledge of human physiology, consciousness, and the relationships between physical and subtle bodies that might represent preserved creation knowledge. The chakra system describing energy centers within the human body, the nadis or channels through which vital forces flow, and the techniques for manipulating these systems all suggest sophisticated understanding of human biological and energetic organization. This knowledge might derive from the creation engineers who designed human systems and transmitted operational manuals to human priests for preservation. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished from 3300 to 1300 BC in regions where Hindu traditions developed, shows archaeological evidence of urban planning, engineering capabilities, and cultural sophistication comparable to contemporary Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations. The apparent coordination between these geographically distant cultures in terms of architectural principles, writing system development, and technological capabilities suggests communication networks that might have facilitated transmission of creation knowledge across ancient world trade routes. Chinese mythology attributes human creation to the goddess Nüwa, who formed humans from yellow clay and brought them to life through divine breath. The texts describe Nüwa creating initial humans through careful individual crafting, but then developing a more efficient mass production method, involving dipping a rope in clay and flinging drops that transformed into humans. This account's progression from careful individual creation to efficient mass production mirrors the Mesopotamian progression from prototype development to industrial-scale reproduction described in the Atrahasis Epic. The earliest references to Nüwa appear in texts from the Warring States period, approximately 4th to 3rd centuries BC, though the traditions themselves clearly preserve much older oral accounts. The Huainanzi, compiled in the 2nd century BC, contains detailed descriptions of Nüwa's creation activities that parallel Mesopotamian accounts in remarkable detail. The text describes how Nüwa mixed yellow earth with water to create a clay suitable for moulding human forms, carefully shaping each figure before breathing life into it. The emphasis on yellow clay as the specific material required for human creation parallels Mesopotamian and Egyptian references to particular types of clay, or earth, possessing properties necessary for biological creation. The yellow colour might indicate clay rich in specific minerals, or might preserve technical terminology referring to genetic material in terms ancient audiences could understand. The Liesi, another early text preserving Nüwa traditions, describes the goddess becoming exhausted from the labour of individually forming each human. This detail resonates strongly with Mesopotamian accounts of the Igigi rebellion, triggered by excessive labour burdens, suggesting that creation work required significant physical effort even for divine beings. The solution Nüwa developed, dragging a rope through clay and flinging droplets that became humans, represents technological innovation that increased production efficiency while reducing labour requirements. The rope method described in Chinese texts apparently produced humans of inferior quality compared to individually crafted specimens. The text explicitly states that carefully moulded humans became nobles and officials, while rope-created humans became common people, establishing social hierarchies based on production methods. This quality stratification based on creation technique parallels Mesopotamian references to different grades of created humans produced through various procedures, with first-generation carefully crafted humans serving in elevated positions, while mass-produced workers performed basic labour. The Chinese accounts describe Nüwa repairing the pillars of heaven and patching the sky after cosmic catastrophes threatened human populations. These repair activities suggest ongoing divine maintenance and intervention in human affairs following initial creation, consistent with Mesopotamian accounts describing continued Anunnaki involvement in managing human populations. The sky repair narratives might preserve memories of climate interventions or atmospheric modifications undertaken to protect created humans from environmental threats. The gender of the creator deity in Chinese tradition differs from the male gods emphasized in Mesopotamian accounts, but aligns with the critical importance of female deities like Ninmah in actual creation procedures. Nüwa's singular responsibility for human creation in Chinese texts might reflect cultural emphasis on female reproductive roles, or might preserve accurate memories that biological engineering required primarily female expertise and participation. The association of Nüwa with fertility, reproduction, and marriage customs in later Chinese tradition supports interpretation of her creation role as fundamentally biological. The timing of human creation in Chinese cosmology places the event during the primordial era after the separation of heaven and earth, but before the establishment of civilization and social order. This chronological framework parallels Mesopotamian placement of creation after cosmic organization but before development of cities and kingdoms. The cross-cultural consistency in timing relative to other mythological events suggests preservation of actual historical sequencing rather than arbitrary narrative structure. The archaeological record from ancient China shows evidence of sudden cultural advancement comparable to developments in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Yangsha culture, flourishing from approximately 5000 to 3000 BC, displayed sophisticated pottery technology, agricultural practices, and social organization that appeared with minimal evidence of gradual development from simpler forms. This pattern of rapid cultural emergence parallels the archaeological signatures associated with created human populations in other regions. The Chinese tradition of silk production, emerging during the Yangshao period, represents a sophisticated biotechnology requiring detailed knowledge of sericulture, including silkworm husbandry, mulberry cultivation, and complex textile processing. The sudden appearance of this advanced technology without clear antecedents might reflect knowledge transmission from divine instructors as described in creation traditions. Similar patterns of inexplicably advanced early technologies appear across ancient civilizations, where creation traditions preserve memories of divine intervention. The linguistic connections between ancient Chinese and other early language families remain controversial among scholars, but some researchers have identified potential cognates between Sino-Tibetan languages and Indo-European or Semitic terms related to creation, biological processes, and technical procedures. These linguistic parallels, if confirmed, would support hypotheses about knowledge transmission across ancient civilizations and preservation of common technical vocabulary derived from creation engineering. The Chinese emphasis on harmony between heaven and earth, expressed throughout philosophical and religious traditions, might preserve understanding that humans represent intermediate beings combining celestial and terrestrial elements. The Taoist concept of humans as microcosms, containing both heavenly yang and earthly yin principles, parallels the Mesopotamian description of humans as mixtures of divine essence and earthly clay. These philosophical frameworks apparently derive from accurate understanding of human dual composition, rather than abstract metaphysical speculation. The Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Kichi Maya, describes how the gods created humans after several failed attempts using different materials. The successful creation involved mixing ground maize with the blood of the gods, producing beings who possessed intelligence and capabilities that alarmed the gods. This account shares remarkable parallels with the Mesopotamian mixture of clay and divine blood, suggesting either cultural transmission or independent preservation of actual historical procedures. The Popol Vuh text, recorded in the 16th century by Spanish-speaking Maya but preserving much older oral traditions, provides one of the most detailed creation narratives from the Americas. The account describes multiple creation attempts by the gods, with each failure providing lessons that informed subsequent efforts. This iterative approach to human creation closely parallels the Mesopotamian documentation of failed experiments before achieving successful results, suggesting both accounts preserve memories of actual developmental processes. The first creation attempt described in the Popol Vuh involved forming humans from mud, but these beings proved unstable and dissolved back into formless matter. The second attempt used wood to create humans, but these wooden beings lacked souls and consciousness, merely going through motions without true understanding. These failed attempts parallel the Mesopotamian accounts of defective creations that lacked proper cognitive or physical characteristics, demonstrating that biological engineering required precise procedures and materials to achieve desired results. The successful creation method combined ground maize with the blood of the gods, a procedure that directly parallels the Mesopotamian mixture of clay with divine blood. The choice of maize as the earthly component reflects the central importance of this crop in Mesoamerican culture, but the underlying principle remains identical. biological creation requires both earthly organic material and divine genetic essence. The grinding of maize into flour might represent ancient understanding that biological materials needed to be processed into forms suitable for combination with divine substances. The text explicitly states that the created humans possessed vision and knowledge that extended too far, enabling them to see and understand everything like the gods themselves. This excessive capability alarmed the creator gods, who held council to determine how to limit human perception and knowledge. The solution involved clouding human vision and restricting their understanding, ensuring that created beings would remain subordinate to their creators. This deliberate limitation of human capabilities parallels Mesopotamian accounts, describing built-in restrictions that prevented humans from rivaling divine powers. The specific method by which the gods limited human capabilities involved breathing a mist over their eyes, clouding their vision so they could perceive only nearby things rather than distant cosmic knowledge. This breathing or misting procedure might preserve memories of biological or genetic modifications affecting human sensory or cognitive processing. The modern understanding that human sensory capabilities are genetically determined and can be modified through genetic engineering supports interpretation of these ancient accounts as describing actual biological procedures. The concern expressed by the gods that humans might become too much like their creators reflects sophisticated understanding of the risks inherent in creating intelligent beings. The Popol Vuh explicitly records divine discussions debating whether beings with godlike knowledge and perception would remain controllable or would eventually challenge divine authority. This risk assessment parallels concerns expressed in Mesopotamian council debates about the dangers of granting humans excessive capabilities, suggesting both traditions preserve memories of actual deliberations about creation parameters. The 4 original humans created through the successful maize and blood procedure became the ancestors of the Quiché Maya people, according to the narrative. These founding individuals, named Balamquitze, Balamakab, Mahukuta, and Ikibalam, were then provided with female companions who were created while the men slept. This detail parallels the biblical account of Eve's creation from Adam's rib, and might preserve memories that female humans were created through slightly different procedures or at different times than males, consistent with Mesopotamian accounts describing careful gender balancing in creation programs. The Popol Vuh describes how these first humans were able to speak and reason, to give thanks to their creators, and to understand the nature of their existence. The emphasis on language and cognitive capabilities as defining characteristics of successful creation parallels the Mesopotamian focus on intelligence and communication as primary enhancements over base hominids. The consistent cross-cultural identification of these traits as distinguishing features suggests they represent the actual targets of genetic modification in historical creation events. The post-creation relationship between gods and humans described in the Popol Vuh involves ongoing divine oversight and intervention, with gods teaching humans agriculture, construction techniques, and social organization. This continued involvement parallels Mesopotamian accounts describing Anunnaki instruction of created humans in various technical skills. The pattern of initial creation, followed by extended training periods, appears consistently across creation traditions from different cultures, suggesting this represented standard procedure in managing created populations. The ritual use of maize in Mesoamerican religious ceremonies might preserve memories of its role in human creation. The special status of maize as sacred food representing the substance of human bodies appears throughout Maya religious practice and art. This theological understanding apparently derives from preserved knowledge that maize served as a component in creation procedures, maintaining its sacred status through millennia of cultural transmission. The archaeological evidence from Mesoamerica shows sophisticated agricultural development, astronomical knowledge, and architectural capabilities appearing with surprising rapidity in pre-classic Maya civilization. The sudden emergence of complex calendar systems, mathematical concepts including zero, and monumental architecture parallels patterns seen in other regions, where creation traditions preserve memories of divine intervention in human development. These technological and intellectual achievements appearing without clear antecedents suggest knowledge transmission from external sources rather than purely indigenous development. Archaeological evidence reveals that agriculture emerged suddenly and simultaneously in multiple locations worldwide approximately 10,000 years ago, a timing that corresponds with the created human's deployment to agricultural labour described in Sumerian texts. The domestication of wheat, barley and other staple crops occurred rapidly rather than through gradual selection, and these domesticated varieties show genetic modifications that appear optimized for human cultivation. The correlation between textual accounts of human creation for agricultural purposes and the archaeological evidence of sudden agricultural development suggests these events are historically connected. The transition from hunter-gatherer subsistence to agricultural food production represents one of the most significant transformations in human history, yet the speed and geographical distribution of this transition challenges conventional models of gradual cultural evolution. Between 10,000 and 8,000 BC, agricultural practices appeared independently in at least 7 different regions, including the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa, New Guinea, and Eastern North America. The near-simultaneous emergence of agriculture across these widely separated regions, with no apparent contact, suggests coordinated implementation of agricultural knowledge rather than independent invention. The domestication of wheat in the Fertile Crescent provides particularly compelling evidence for rapid rather than gradual development. Wild einkorn and emmer wheat show dramatic genetic differences from their domesticated descendants, including changes that made seeds remain on the plant for easier harvesting rather than shattering and dispersing naturally. These modifications, which would have taken thousands of generations to achieve through natural selection of random mutations, apparently occurred within a few hundred years according to archaeological evidence. The speed of this transformation suggests directed breeding programs guided by knowledge of desired outcomes rather than accidental selection. The genetic changes distinguishing domesticated wheat from wild varieties involve modifications to multiple genes controlling seed dispersal, seed coat thickness, germination timing, and plant architecture. The probability of all these beneficial mutations occurring spontaneously and being selected simultaneously appears astronomically low according to population genetics models. However, if ancient agriculturalists understood genetic principles and deliberately selected and bred plants for specific traits, the rapid domestication timeline becomes explicable. The Sumerian texts describing divine instruction in agricultural techniques might preserve memories of this directed breeding knowledge. Barley domestication shows similar patterns of rapid genetic modification, producing varieties optimized for human cultivation. Domesticated barley developed non-brittle rachis preventing seed shattering, larger seeds with higher nutritional content, and reduced germination dormancy enabling predictable planting schedules. These traits, while disadvantageous for wild plant survival, perfectly serve human agricultural needs. The apparent optimization of domesticated crops for human use, rather than wild fitness, suggests intentional design rather than natural adaptation. The coordination of plant domestication with animal domestication further suggests systematic implementation of agricultural programs. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were all domesticated in the same regions and time periods as cereal crops, providing complementary protein sources and labour animals. The simultaneous domestication of multiple species with different reproductive rates and behavioural characteristics indicates sophisticated understanding of animal husbandry rather than fortunate accidents. The genetic changes required for animal domestication, including behavioural modifications reducing fear of humans and physiological changes enabling breeding in captivity, parallel the directed modifications seen in crop plants, archaeological sites from the pre-pottery Neolithic period in the Fertile Crescent show evidence of sudden sedentary settlement patterns coinciding with agricultural adoption. Villages like Jericho and Çatalhöyük appeared with populations in the thousands supported by agricultural production, displaying sophisticated architecture, craft specialization, and social organization without clear antecedents in earlier hunter-gatherer camps. This abrupt transition from mobile foraging to settled farming communities suggests introduction of agricultural knowledge, enabling new subsistence strategies rather than gradual cultural evolution. The irrigation technologies appearing early in agricultural development demonstrate engineering knowledge that supposedly required centuries of experimentation to develop. Mesopotamian sites from the Ubaid period show sophisticated canal systems, water management infrastructure, and drainage networks that enabled intensive agriculture in otherwise marginal environments. The technical expertise required for these hydraulic engineering projects suggests access to transmitted knowledge rather than trial and error learning. The Sumerian accounts describing Enki's instruction in water management techniques might preserve memories of this knowledge transfer. The development of pottery technology coinciding with agricultural adoption provides additional evidence for coordinated technological advancement. Ceramic vessels appeared rapidly across multiple regions during the Neolithic, enabling food storage and preparation methods that supported agricultural subsistence. The technical knowledge required for pottery production, including clay selection, tempering, forming techniques, and firing procedures, represents specialized expertise that conventional models suggest should have required extended developmental periods. The tools and implements associated with early agriculture show sophistication, suggesting inherited rather than invented technology. Polished stone axes, sickles with hafted flint blades, grinding stones, and specialized harvesting tools all appear in archaeological contexts without clear evolutionary precursors. The optimal designs of these tools for specific agricultural tasks suggest they were created according to predetermined specifications, rather than through gradual refinement of general-purpose implements. The surplus food production enabled by agriculture created the economic foundation for specialized labor, urban development, and civilizational complexity. The Sumerian texts describe created humans as being assigned to agricultural work that would support divine operations, suggesting that agricultural development was purposefully directed toward creating food surpluses that could sustain non-agricultural specialists, including craftsmen, administrators, and priests. The correlation between agricultural productivity and civilizational advancement appearing in the archaeological record supports this instrumental relationship. The rapid spread of agricultural practices from initial centres of domestication to surrounding regions occurred through mechanisms that remain debated among archaeologists. The demographic expansion of farming populations apparently displaced or absorbed hunter-gatherer groups across vast territories within relatively brief time periods. This agricultural expansion might reflect advantages conferred by superior subsistence technology, but the speed and consistency of the process suggests coordinated dissemination of agricultural knowledge rather than purely economic competition. Sumerian texts consistently describe mining operations as a primary purpose for which humans were created, and archaeological evidence from southern Africa reveals extensive ancient mining operations dating to the periods described in the creation texts. Excavations at sites in Swaziland and South Africa have uncovered mining shafts extending hundreds of feet underground, dating to between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. Periods when no known civilization should have possessed such capabilities. The presence of stone tools and evidence of organized labor at these sites supports textual accounts of pre-civilizational mining programs. The discovery of these ancient mines initially occurred during 20th century commercial mining operations, when modern excavations encountered prehistoric workings at depths that conventional archaeology considered impossible for ancient peoples. At Ngwenya, in Swaziland, Iron ore mining operations uncovered ancient shafts descending over 20 meters below surface, with radiocarbon dating of charcoal and bone fragments recovered from these levels, indicating ages between 43,000 and 23,000 years. The extent and organization of these mining operations imply sustained efforts by substantial workforces rather than opportunistic surface collection by small groups. The Lion Cavern site at Nüwa shows evidence of systematic hematite extraction beginning approximately 43,000 years ago and continuing for tens of thousands of years. The mining techniques employed included fire setting to fracture rock, followed by extraction using stone tools to remove the loosened ore. The volume of material removed from these ancient workings, estimated at thousands of tons, indicates industrial-scale operations requiring coordinated labour forces, supply chains, and administrative oversight. The sophistication of these mining operations challenges conventional understanding of Stone Age technological capabilities. The Popol Ridge site in Swaziland contains evidence of mining activities dating to approximately 100,000 years ago, pushing the antiquity of organised extraction operations far beyond the periods when modern humans supposedly possessed capabilities for such enterprises. Archaeological investigations revealed mining galleries, waste rock dumps, and evidence of ore processing that demonstrates systematic exploitation of mineral resources. The tools recovered from these sites include specialized implements apparently designed for specific mining tasks rather than general-purpose equipment adapted to extraction work. The metallurgical knowledge implied by these ancient mining operations raises profound questions about the purpose and beneficiaries of the extracted materials. Stone Age populations had limited ability to process and utilize the ores being mined, suggesting that the extracted materials were intended for more technologically advanced users. The Sumerian accounts describing Anunnaki mining operations conducted initially by the Igigi and later by created humans provide context for understanding who directed and benefited from these ancient extraction programs. The geographical distribution of ancient mining sites corresponds closely with regions that Sumerian texts associate with Anunnaki operations. Southern Africa, referenced in some interpretations of Mesopotamian texts as the land of the Abzu where Enki maintained operations, contains the most extensive evidence of prehistoric mining. The correlation between textual references and archaeological sites supports interpretation of these texts as preserving geographical knowledge about actual historical operations rather than mythological geography. The transition from Igigi to human labour in mining operations described in Mesopotamian texts corresponds chronologically with the dating of the most intensive mining phases at southern African sites. The period between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, when mining activities apparently peaked according to archaeological evidence, aligns with the time frame when Sumerian accounts describe the creation of humans specifically to relieve divine workers from underground labour. This temporal correlation suggests the archaeological and textual evidence describe the same historical events from different perspectives. The specialized tools found at ancient mining sites include implements for breaking rock, extracting ore, crushing and grinding minerals, and transporting materials. The standardization of these tools across different mining sites suggests centralized design and distribution rather than independent local invention. The Sumerian accounts describing divine instruction in mining techniques might preserve memories of this knowledge transfer to human workers who required training in specialized extraction procedures. The evidence for ore processing at these ancient sites indicates that mining operations included refining activities that separated valuable minerals from waste rock. The presence of grinding stones, washing channels, and concentrated mineral deposits suggests knowledge of beneficiation techniques that increase the purity of extracted materials. These processing capabilities exceed what conventional archaeology attributes to Stone Age populations, and support textual accounts describing technologically sophisticated oversight of mining operations. The scale of ancient mining operations implies supporting infrastructure including worker housing, food supply systems, tool manufacturing facilities, and administrative oversight. While direct evidence of such infrastructure remains limited due to the antiquity of these sites, the existence of sustained extraction operations over thousands of years requires explanation of how large workforces were maintained in regions without obvious agricultural capacity. The Sumerian accounts describing divine provision of food rations to human workers might preserve memories of the logistics supporting these mining operations. The environmental impact of ancient mining visible in landscape modifications, deforestation for fuel and timber, and erosion from waste dumps provides additional evidence for the industrial scale of these operations. The magnitude of environmental disturbance exceeds what small-scale opportunistic mining would produce and indicates sustained intensive extraction over extended periods. The abrupt cessation of mining activities at many sites around 60,000 years ago, indicated by cessation of carbon-dated materials and abandonment of active workings, corresponds with Sumerian references to major disruptions in divine operations that preceded the flood catastrophe. This coordinated abandonment of mining sites across large geographical areas suggests centralized decision-making rather than independent local choices, supporting interpretation that these operations served organized programs directed by advanced administrators. The knowledge of metallurgy implied by ancient mining extends beyond simple ore extraction to include understanding of which mineral deposits contained valuable materials and how to locate and exploit them efficiently. The selective targeting of high-grade deposits and the systematic exploitation of entire ore bodies demonstrate geological knowledge that conventional archaeology considers impossible for the periods in question. The Sumerian accounts attributing metallurgical knowledge to divine instruction provide context for understanding how ancient miners possessed expertise far exceeding what their Stone Age cultural context would predict. The sudden appearance of sophisticated urban planning in Sumerian cities around 3500 BC demonstrates knowledge that appears to have been transmitted rather than developed gradually. The city of Uruk, in its earliest phases, displayed advanced concepts including zoned districts, sophisticated drainage systems, and standardized building modules that suggest implementation of existing design principles rather than experimental development. The Sumerian texts explicitly attribute this urban planning knowledge to divine instruction, provided as humans transitioned from purely agricultural labor to city-based civilization. The archaeological evidence from Uruk reveals urban planning sophistication that appears fully developed in the earliest city levels, rather than showing evolutionary refinement from simpler organizational patterns. The city covered nearly 6 square kilometers by 3500 BC, with population estimates ranging from 40,000 to 80,000 inhabitants. This population density required advanced planning to provide water, manage waste, facilitate commerce, and maintain social order. The infrastructure supporting such large populations appeared simultaneously with the city itself rather than being gradually added as problems emerged. The zoning system separating residential, commercial, and religious districts in early Uruk demonstrates conceptual urban planning that conventional archaeology considers too sophisticated for the period. The temple precincts occupied elevated positions on artificial platforms, separating sacred spaces from secular areas while creating visual focal points dominating the urban landscape. The commercial districts concentrated near the city gates and waterfront, facilitating trade and transport. The residential quarters displayed internal organization, with houses arranged along streets in grid patterns rather than organic cluster growth. This systematic differentiation of urban functions suggests implementation of comprehensive plans rather than incremental development. The drainage and water management systems in early Sumerian cities show engineering sophistication requiring advanced hydraulic knowledge. Underground drainage channels constructed from baked brick carried wastewater away from residential areas to disposal points outside the city walls. The gradient calculations necessary to ensure proper flow, the structural engineering required to prevent channel collapse, and the urban planning needed to integrate drainage with street layouts all demonstrate technical expertise far beyond what trial and error experimentation would produce in initial urban development. The standardization of building components visible in early Sumerian architecture suggests centralized production and quality control systems. Bricks conform to standard dimensions, enabling efficient construction and architectural planning based on modular units. The standardization extends to door frames, roof beams, and other structural elements, indicating systematic approaches to construction that would enable rapid urban development once planning decisions were made. This industrial approach to construction appears suddenly rather than evolving from earlier building traditions. The street systems in early Uruk and other Sumerian cities show deliberate planning with straight alignments, consistent widths, and intersections designed for efficient traffic flow. The streets connected major buildings and gates according to apparent plans that prioritized accessibility and circulation. The maintenance of street alignments across multiple phases of rebuilding suggests that urban plans were documented and preserved, rather than being allowed to evolve organically through successive construction episodes. The city walls surrounding Sumerian urban centers demonstrate military engineering knowledge, including optimal wall heights and thicknesses, strategic gate placement, and integration of walls with natural defensive features. The construction techniques employed in these fortifications, including foundations extending below ground level, battered wall profiles for stability, and crenellated tops for defensive positions, all show sophisticated understanding of military architecture. The appearance of these advanced fortification designs in the earliest urban phases suggests transmitted knowledge rather than hard-won experience. The public buildings in early Sumerian cities, including temples, palaces, and administrative centers, show architectural sophistication that conventional models consider premature for newly urbanized populations. The use of columns, arches, courtyards, and multi-story construction demonstrates structural engineering knowledge that supposedly required centuries to develop. The incorporation of astronomical alignments, acoustic properties, and symbolic geometries in these buildings suggests that architectural knowledge encompassed both practical and theoretical dimensions. The Sumerian texts describing divine instruction in city planning might preserve memories of actual knowledge transfer that enabled humans to construct urban centers according to predetermined specifications. The references to gods measuring and laying out cities, establishing foundations, and instructing humans in construction techniques all suggest systematic teaching of urban planning principles. The archaeological evidence of sophisticated planning appearing suddenly in the earlier cities supports interpretation that this knowledge came from external sources rather than arising through gradual cultural evolution. The administrative systems required to govern Sumerian cities show organizational sophistication, matching the physical planning. The earliest written records document complex bureaucracies managing food distribution, labor allocation, land tenure, and craft production. The accounting systems employed standardized measures, systematic record-keeping, and hierarchical administration that enabled coordination of economic activities across large populations. This administrative infrastructure appears simultaneously with urban development, rather than being improvised to meet emerging challenges. The replication of urban planning principles across multiple Sumerian cities suggests dissemination of standardized knowledge rather than independent invention at each site. Cities like Ur, Eridu, Nippur, and Lagash all display similar zoning, drainage, fortification, and architectural features despite being founded in different locations by different populations. This consistency indicates that urban planners across Sumer shared common training in city design principles, supporting textual accounts describing divine instruction transmitted to human administrators throughout the region. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Sumerian texts, including precise calculations of planetary movements and the precessional cycle, demonstrates intellectual capabilities that were supposedly given to humans during creation. The texts describe how Enki opened the eyes of created humans to enable them to perceive not just physical reality, but also abstract concepts including mathematics, astronomy, and cosmic principles. The correlation between textual claims of divinely granted intellectual enhancement and the archaeological evidence of sudden cognitive advancement supports the interpretation that human intelligence resulted from deliberate intervention. The mathematical sophistication of Sumerian astronomy exceeds what conventional archaeology considers possible for early Bronze Age civilizations. The base 60 number system developed in Mesopotamia enabled calculations involving large numbers and fractional values with efficiency approaching modern positional notation. The choice of 60 as a base provides mathematical advantages, including divisibility by multiple factors, facilitating calculations involving time, angles, and circular measurements. The sophistication of this mathematical system suggests it was designed according to theoretical principles rather than evolving through practical necessity. The astronomical observations documented in cuneiform tablets demonstrate precision requiring instruments and techniques supposedly unavailable to ancient observers. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa record detailed observations of planetary positions, heliacal risings, and synodic periods that match modern calculations within margins of error, requiring sophisticated measurement capabilities. The consistency of observations across multiple tablets spanning different historical periods indicates systematic observation programs maintaining continuity across generations rather than sporadic casual skywatching. The identification and tracking of planetary movements visible in Sumerian astronomical texts requires recognition that certain bright objects in the sky move relative to fixed stars according to complex patterns requiring mathematical modelling. The ability to distinguish planets from stars, predict their future positions, and calculate their synodic periods demonstrates geometrical and mathematical capabilities that conventional models consider too advanced for the 3rd millennium BC. The Sumerian texts attributing astronomical knowledge to divine instruction provide context for understanding how ancient astronomers possessed capabilities exceeding their supposed cultural context. The calculation of the precessional cycle documented in Mesopotamian astronomy represents one of the most sophisticated astronomical achievements of the ancient world. Precession, the slow rotation of Earth's axis causing the position of celestial North Pole to shift over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, requires centuries of careful observation to detect an additional time to calculate the complete cycle period. The Sumerian familiarity with this cycle, embedded in their sacred numbers and mythological time periods, suggests they inherited astronomical knowledge accumulated over far longer periods than their civilization's documented history. The astronomical alignments incorporated into Mesopotamian architecture demonstrate knowledge of celestial phenomena including solstices, equinoxes, and stellar positions requiring precise observational capabilities. Ziggurat structures show orientations towards specific stars and constellations that held significance in Mesopotamian cosmology. The precision of these alignments, maintained across multiple construction phases spanning centuries, indicates systematic astronomical observation programs and preserved knowledge enabling future builders to replicate orientations established in earlier structures. The celestial divination systems preserved in texts like the Enuma Anu Enlil demonstrate sophisticated understanding of correlations between astronomical phenomena and terrestrial events. The mathematical relationships between planetary cycles, eclipse periods, and seasonal variations documented in these omen collections required systematic data collection an analysis spanning multiple generations. The organization of this astronomical knowledge into comprehensive reference text indicates institutional supports for astronomical research and knowledge preservation that conventional archaeology considers premature for Bronze Age civilizations. The Sumerian creation accounts describing intellectual enhancement as a primary goal of genetic modification find support in the archaeological evidence of sudden cognitive advancement visible in the material record. The emergence of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex social organization within relatively brief time periods suggests quantum increases in intellectual capabilities rather than gradual cultural evolution. The textual attribution of these capabilities to divine intervention provides explanatory framework for understanding the temporal clustering of cognitive achievements. The relationship between enhanced intellectual capabilities and the practical needs of agricultural and urban life apparent in Sumerian texts suggests that cognitive enhancement was purposefully directed towards specific applications. The ability to perform astronomical calculations enabled development of accurate calendars for agricultural planning. The capacity for mathematical reasoning supported administrative systems managing complex economic activities. The facility with abstract symbolic thought enabled writing systems that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. These practical applications of enhanced cognition align with textual accounts describing human creation for specific labor purposes requiring particular capabilities. The preservation of astronomical and mathematical knowledge through Mesopotamian scribal schools indicates that intellectual capabilities were considered precious resources requiring institutional protection. The specialized training required to master cuneiform writing, astronomical calculation, and mathematical techniques created elite classes of literate specialists who maintained and transmitted advanced knowledge. The existence of these educational institutions in earlier Sumerian cities supports textual accounts describing systematic training of humans in knowledge domains that divine instructors had opened to human understanding. Contemporary genetic engineering techniques bear striking resemblance to the procedures described in ancient Sumerian creation texts. Modern methods for introducing foreign genetic material into existing organisms, creating transgenic species, and enhancing specific traits through targeted genetic modification parallel the ancient descriptions of mixing divine essence with earthly clay to produce enhanced beings. The technical feasibility of the procedures described in text thousands of years old suggests these accounts preserve memories of actual genetic engineering projects rather than primitive creation mythology. The development of recombinant DNA technology in the 1970s enabled scientists to isolate genes from one organism and insert them into another species, creating transgenic organisms possessing characteristics derived from both genetic sources. This procedure of combining genetic material from different sources to produce novel organisms directly parallels the Sumerian description of mixing divine blood with earthly clay to create humans possessing both divine and earthly characteristics. The conceptual and procedural similarities suggest the ancient texts describe the same fundamental processes using metaphorical language comprehensible to ancient audiences. The CRISPR gene editing technology developed in the 21st century enables precise modification of genetic sequences within living organisms, allowing scientists to delete, modify, or insert specific genes with unprecedented accuracy. This capability to deliberately design organisms with specific traits represents the ultimate realization of the directed genetic modification described in ancient creation accounts. The ability to enhance intelligence, extend lifespan, increase physical capabilities, or introduce entirely novel characteristics through genetic engineering demonstrates that the outcomes described in Sumerian texts are technically achievable. The creation of transgenic animals incorporating human genetic material has produced organisms that blur traditional species boundaries in ways that parallel the ancient descriptions of creating intermediate beings combining different biological sources. Mice with human brain cells, pigs with human organs, and primates with human genetic modifications all represent contemporary examples of the mixed creation described in ancient texts. The ethical debates surrounding these genetic engineering projects echo the concerns expressed in Sumerian accounts about the appropriate boundaries of creation and the risks of producing beings that might challenge their creators. The optimization of organisms for specific functions through genetic engineering mirrors the Sumerian accounts describing purposeful design of humans for particular labor roles. The genetic modification of plants to produce higher yields, resist pests, or tolerate environmental stresses represents directed evolution toward human-defined goals rather than natural adaptation to wild environments. The genetic engineering of animals to produce pharmaceutical compounds, serve as organ donors, or model human diseases demonstrates instrumental approaches to biological creation that treat organisms as resources designed for specific purposes. The development of synthetic biology enabling construction of entirely artificial organisms from designed genetic sequences represents the most extreme form of biological engineering possible. The creation of synthetic bacteria with minimal genomes containing only genes necessary for specific functions demonstrates that life can be reduced to engineered systems designed according to predetermined specifications. This capability to construct organisms from first principles validates the ancient concept that living beings could be created through deliberate design, rather than only through natural reproduction. The use of human genetic material in creating enhanced or modified organisms raises profound ethical questions about the moral status of such beings and the rights and responsibilities of their creators. These contemporary debates mirror the implicit ethical issues in ancient creation accounts regarding the relationship between creators and created beings. The Sumerian texts treating created humans as property assigned to divine owners for specific purposes reflect attitudes similar to contemporary perspectives, treating genetically modified organisms as intellectual property, designed and owned by their creators. The rapid pace of genetic engineering advances suggests that capabilities described in ancient texts as divine prerogatives may soon become routine human activities. The enhancement of human intelligence through genetic modification, extension of human lifespan through telomere manipulation, and augmentation of physical capabilities through genetic optimization all appear technically feasible within coming decades. The realization of these capabilities will transform humans into the role ancient texts attributed to the Anunnaki, beings capable of deliberately designing and creating other living organisms according to predetermined specifications. The preservation of genetic engineering knowledge in ancient texts separated from its technological implementation by thousands of years suggests that previous civilizations achieved capabilities that were subsequently lost during civilizational collapses. The detailed technical accuracy of ancient creation accounts describing procedures that only became possible with late 20th century technology indicates these texts preserved memories of actual historical events rather than imaginative speculation. The archaeological evidence of sudden human advancement in cognitive capabilities, physical characteristics, and cultural achievements aligns with textual accounts describing deliberate genetic modification, producing enhanced humans optimized for specific purposes. The convergence of evidence across multiple domains presents a compelling case that fundamentally challenges conventional understanding of human origins and development. The Sumerian tablets describing systematic biological engineering of humans through mixture of divine genetic material with base hominid stock find remarkable support in modern genetic research, revealing recent and dramatic modifications to human DNA that conventional evolutionary models struggle to explain. The sudden appearance of chromosome 2 through fusion of ancestral chromosomes, the recent mutations in genes controlling language and cognitive development, and the discontinuous increase in cranial capacity all point toward intervention rather than gradual natural selection as the mechanism producing anatomically modern humans. The cross-cultural consistency of creation narratives spanning Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hindu, Chinese, and Mesoamerican traditions reveals preservation of common knowledge about human origins rather than independent mythological invention. The specific technical details shared across these geographically separated accounts, including the mixture of earthly organic material with divine essence, the iterative experimental process involving failed attempts before achieving success, and the deliberate limitation of created human capabilities to ensure controllability, all suggest these traditions preserve memories of actual historical events witnessed and recorded by ancient populations. The archaeological evidence of capabilities appearing suddenly rather than developing gradually supports textual accounts of knowledge transmission from advanced sources. The emergence of agriculture simultaneously across multiple continents with domesticated crops, showing genetic optimization for human use, the existence of sophisticated mining operations in southern Africa, dating to periods when no known civilization possessed such capabilities, the appearance of fully developed urban planning in earlier Sumerian cities, and the demonstration of astronomical and mathematical knowledge exceeding expected Bronze Age achievements all indicate that human civilizational development received guidance from sources possessing advanced scientific and technical knowledge. The parallels between ancient creation procedures and modern genetic engineering techniques validate the technical accuracy of accounts written thousands of years before such capabilities were officially achieved. The description of mixing genetic material from different sources to produce organisms with combined characteristics, the systematic approach to optimizing traits through iterative experimentation, and the deliberate design of limitations ensuring created beings remain controllable, all represent procedures that contemporary genetic engineering has demonstrated to be scientifically feasible. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond academic archaeology to encompass fundamental questions about human nature, purpose, and potential. If humans represent engineered beings designed for specific functions rather than products of undirected natural evolution, the meaning of human existence requires re-evaluation. The capabilities and limitations incorporated into human design by ancient genetic engineers continue to shape human consciousness, behavior, and civilizational development thousands of years after the creation events described in ancient texts. The preservation of creation knowledge through mystery schools, religious traditions, and esoteric organizations ensured that understanding of human origins survived across millennia of cultural change and civilizational collapse. The consistency of core creation narratives despite thousands of years of transmission suggests that ancient institutions successfully maintained essential knowledge even as political systems rose and fell. This preserved wisdom offers contemporary humanity crucial insights into our own nature and the parameters within which we operate as designed beings. As modern genetic engineering approaches capabilities that ancient texts attribute to divine creators, humanity stands at a threshold where we may replicate the creation processes that produced our own species. The ethical frameworks developed through millennia of religious and philosophical reflection on creation narratives provide essential guidance for navigating the profound responsibilities that accompany such power. Understanding ourselves as created beings who are becoming creators offers perspective on the challenges and opportunities facing contemporary civilization, as we develop technologies that enable deliberate modification of human biology and potentially the creation of entirely new forms of intelligent life